Good morning and welcome to the 22nd meeting of the Health and Sport Committee in 2012. And as I usually do at this point, can I remind all those present that mobile phones and Blackberries should be turned off, as they can often interfere with the sound system. Agenda item number 1 this morning, the first item on our agenda, is a decision to take item 3 in private. This is consideration of the programme of evidence for the community sport inquiry, which we recently discussed. If there is no good reason to hold it in private, then I would intend to hold that section in public. Do I have the committee's agreement?
That's fine.
Thank you. We now move to agenda item number 2, which is the beginning of our inquiry into support for community sport. And we now have our first panel, which I would like to welcome this morning. We have Stuart Harris, Chief Executive, and Mary Allison, Head of Strategic Planning, Sport Scotland. Lee Cousins is along as the Chairman. Welcome to you all from Sport Scotland. Scottish Sports Association, sorry. It's certainly not in my brief, but I'll plough on. Kim Atkinson, Lee Cousins is Chairman of Sport Scotland, Kim Atkinson, Policy Director of the Sports Association, and Anne Kerr, Head of Healthy Living, and John Howie, Health Improvement Programme Manager, NHS Health Scotland. Welcome to you all. And we'll move quickly to our first question, which is from Gil Patterson.
Thanks very much, Convener. Good morning, everybody. I noticed in the Scottish Sports Association that you say that there's 150,000 people who volunteer in sport in Scotland. I don't in any way wish to challenge it, so I take that as read. So I'm just trying to establish how you come about these figures and who we're talking about. But it's pretty consistent with the large number of responses we've had to our consultation in this. So, you know, it's very, very high numbers. But, for instance, my wife, just this week, my daughter's in a gymnastics club, and my wife's been out trying to raise funds, chapping doors at small businesses, big businesses, looking for raffle prizes and bits and pieces, and she manned stalls. But as far as I'm aware, she's not registered as a volunteer in any way. Would she be included in that 150,000, or is there even more supporting, you know, is there hidden volunteers that we don't know about?
Yes.
Hi, sorry, morning, Gil. I think that's a very fair challenge, and I think with any survey, it's a very fair challenge. Is have we captured everything? My guess is that would be a fairly conservative estimate as to the number of people that volunteer. I believe that a third of all adults who volunteer each year volunteer in sport, and half of all young people who volunteer in sport. So that gives us an element of a sense, as you say, of that scale. But I'm sure there are volunteers that are missed out. I think there's a challenge around the definition of the word volunteer, perhaps particularly in sport. I think if you ask many people who are involved in what we might traditionally think of as volunteering in sport, most of them would probably tell you they help out. So as to actually saying, you know, are you a volunteer in sport? Well, you know, the mums or dads that wash the, you know, cricket kit or the baton twirling kit, I'll bet don't think they're volunteering, but actually if they're watching the team kit, then you know it's volunteering in the same way as the coach on the pitch or the referee. So I think part of the challenge is around some of the definition for that. Therefore, my estimate is that would be a very conservative estimate as to the 150,000. But it's still a significant part of our community, and it's still a significant part of the volunteering community, and perhaps the largest part of the volunteering community, those that volunteer in sport. But also in addition to that, as I'm sure you'll have read, a fifth of our population are members of a sports club. So again, that's sports club membership, that's not private gym memberships, that's not football supporters clubs, that's the 13,000 voluntary sports clubs. So I think it emphasises the scale of the community, that not only volunteering in sport, but that sport is amongst our communities.
Well, funny enough, you highlight something. I spoke to my wife, and she didn't recognise herself as a volunteer. She was just a mum you know, when she turns up to take my daughter, she also does a wee bit to help. But, you know, so I thought that would be the case. That leads me to...
Responses, because
Yeah,
others want
fine,
to respond
yeah,
to you,
I'm-
Gil. Mary
I'm
Allison,
happy,
please.
happy to hear that, yeah.
Just really to give you some clarification on the figures, the Scottish Household Survey gathers data about volunteering, and about 30% of adults in Scotland volunteer in total for anything. 15% of that number volunteer in sport, and it's one of the most popular, you know, forms of volunteering. That figure equates to about 4.5% of the Scottish population in total volunteering in sport. So that's about the figure, and that's consistent with volunteering in sport in Wales, Northern Ireland and in England. So we've reasonable, you know, reason to be robust about that, because it's about the proportion that other countries get as well. And that is, roughly speaking, a slightly bigger number. It's about 195,000 adults in Scotland, we estimate, from the Scottish Household Survey, which would pick up a fairly robust sample. It's a sample that would be used for measuring all sorts of other policy areas.
Any other comments on that, or will I move on to... It just leads me nicely on to my next question. And I wondered if you had some information with regards to how we do business in Scotland in this regard compared to European countries. Is the foundation of sport in Europe the same as in Scotland? It looks to me as if, take away the volunteers, sport would effectively almost collapse. But is it the same model there, or do they do it different?
Yes, yes. Yes.
Okay. We've got some data around volunteering in Europe as well. It's been one of the themes the European Union have been looking at, volunteering in sport. About the highest proportion of volunteering is in Finland, around 11% there. But they have a very, very small public sector support for sport. So I think Holland and Netherlands are around 10%. So countries that have a very limited public sector provision tend to have a higher voluntary sector provision. We're probably somewhere in the mid-range. Compared to other, we have a bit of a balance of public-private and a big voluntary sector, but not as big a voluntary sector as you would find in some other European countries.
Yes,
Yep.
Stuart, Aris.
Structurally, I think we've got a wee bit of catch-up to do around community sport, because I think much of Europe has had an emphasis on communities, sustainable communities, and communities supporting their own sports clubs. Some very high-profile examples around big football clubs. We have lots of attached sports, but it gets right down into the heart of communities. Many Scandinavian countries, there's a per capita support for members in sport clubs. Now, I guess the focus of your inquiry is based on that. I think we are ambitious now. I think we are trying to give these opportunities to communities across Scotland. And I think if we are to achieve increases in participation, in volunteerism, in sport, in opportunities, then we have to continue down this path. And I'm sure we'll get into some of the detail, convener, of that as part of this conversation.
Yeah, can I just add that I think the structure of sports clubs, if you're comparing us with Europe, is slightly different. They tend to be an awful lot bigger by a scale of 10 or even 20, whereas an average sports club in Scotland is probably about 60 members, something of that order. It could be 600, it could be 6,000 in some of the European countries. The result is that they do have the capability of hiring professionals, if you understand me, as part of their governance and part of their organisation. Whereas, because we have smaller clubs that don't have that sort of income flow, we tend to be much more reliant on volunteers around certain key posts and certain key governance issues as well, and facility management thing, which you wouldn't see in the continent. So there has, if you want to go forward, and I understand where Stuart's coming from, you have to find some alternative way of supporting these volunteers, because it's not self-supporting by virtue of scale.
Yeah. That's fine, convener. I'll let other members. I'm sure we'll be
Nanette?
wandering into that just shortly.
Yeah, it's an
Thanks,
important
Convener.
area.
I keep hearing it at community level, not particularly in sport, but like things like scouting, guiding, these sort of things, the difficulty in getting volunteers and retaining them. Is that an issue within the sporting world? And if so, what do you see as the main barriers to people coming forward as volunteers?
I'll just. I think there is. I think in answering that question, you have to look at certainly two types of volunteer. I think one is the volunteer that's around the activity, i.e., the coach, the official, the person washing the strips. I think anecdotally, I don't think that is any more difficult to find that type of volunteer than it has been in the past. And in fact, I would think, again, anecdotally, most governing bodies with a good coaching structure will tell you that the number of coaches is going up and it's improving, and they actually affiliate more people each year. What is more difficult, it was probably ever thus, but more difficult now, I think, is the volunteer that's more around the governance issues. You know, it's finding your treasurer, finding your chairman, finding your membership secretary, finding your child protection officer. That side, I think, is actually quite difficult. And if you don't have growth in both types of volunteer, then a club gets imbalanced and doesn't grow. Either a lack of coaches, which I don't think is so difficult, or lack of people that are willing to do the organisational part of the club will prevent it growing. And it's the second type of volunteer, I think, that is our biggest difficulty at the moment. In terms of barriers, it's the usual one. It's time. You know, it's having that available time and having it at the right time. Part of it, I do think, is our culture. We need to make sure that when we go seeking volunteers, we make sure it's fun and enjoyable. It's that person's hobby, after all. What you can't do to someone is say, look, you know, unless you become treasurer, your club collapses. Well, that's my stress, and I'm just giving that stress to someone else. Come and join my stress. That's not a way to invite someone to become volunteer. So I think it's about, a lot of it's about how we ask the questions. A lot of people will tell you that, well, I haven't volunteered because I was never asked. And I think it's how you ask and how attractive you make the proposition. If you make the role clear, if you make the purpose for the role, and you give them some scale of the task, then I actually think getting volunteers is entirely possible. Would be my view.
Bjorn Harris.
A little bit of a personal anecdote here as well. I mean, I currently volunteer as a basketball coach, have done for 25, 30 years. Time is a bit of a barrier, but I try and get over it. But there's a little bit, I agree with everything Lee said around time, and there's lots of other little things that get in people's way. However, there is a leadership issue as well. My own basketball club, one of the reasons I went back was to try and give some help to the coaches that were already there, given the length of my experience. But it was an opportunity, I think, to put back in a different way. I'm still coaching on a weekly basis a team, but I'm also trying to help mentor and give confidence. And I think that's a really important thing about people volunteering nowadays, about having that confidence of being part of something and being given guidance and support down the way. I think it's a key issue. It's one at Sport Scotland that we're very clear about. And again, if I may say so, convener, I think it will come up again when we talk about community sport clubs, hubs, about the leadership factor in all of that.
Kim Atkinson.
Just to come off that, I agree with the leadership and the confidence. I think that's certainly part of it. As Lee said, I think time, or the perception of time, I don't think it matters which, if people have the perception that time's a barrier, it is a barrier to them. And as Lee said about people having ever been asked to volunteer is quite often a barrier. Most people say they don't volunteer because they haven't been asked within the kind of structure that Lee was saying, where it is, this is the amount of time, this is what we'll get out of it. But I think also people don't necessarily know where to go to volunteer, and I think there's more that we can do to make that accessible to people. And I think it's about, I think when we ask people to volunteer, we're very much a culture of please, please volunteer, we need you to help, like Lee was saying, as opposed to looking at volunteering slightly differently and saying, well, here, you will enjoy this. Here are the kinds of things that you might get out of it. Here are the kinds of experiences, the kind of people that you might meet. Actually, why volunteering is something I choose to do, as Stuart was saying, in my own personal time, because I enjoy it and these are the things I get out of it. So you might enjoy it as well, as opposed to, please, please, we need somebody to help. So I think there's a way that we not sell marketing, but there's a way that there's a sort of different phrase and different language I think that we can use that appeals. I think one of the opportunities around that is around something employer-supported volunteering, for want of a better phrase. So if people say their two key barriers are a lack of knowledge as to where to go to volunteer and a lack of time to volunteer, then there's an opportunity to look slightly differently at the culture of volunteering to say, how do we make that happen? So how do we get employers engaged to say, well, actually, is there an opportunity for flexible working hours? You know, if you have a volunteering commitment for the local Highland Dancing Club at 3 o'clock in an afternoon, that's where quite often people are time short. But if you have somebody with those skills, whether it is as the secretary or whether it is as the coach, if somebody has that skill and that interest, how do we match them to that opportunity through employers providing credited working hours, flexible volunteering, saying, well, actually, we'll, as our corporate social responsibility, we'll give you that 2 hours that Wednesday to go and help at the club. But then also that needs to be supported by a system within the employer to say, well, Joe Bloggs is interested in coming along. How do we find an opportunity? Where is there a database? And I think there are a number of databases that contain volunteering opportunities, but I do think we need to do more to try and get the club information onto those to make sure that all the opportunities do exist there. And then how we get that message out to the wider public to say, if you'd like to volunteer, volunteering's for you, there's something for you, here's how you can get involved. So I think there are a couple of opportunities in there, Convener, where we really can overcome those two key barriers.
Mary Allison?
Yeah, it was just, I think there's some signs for us to be optimistic in sport. I think the attraction of sport compared to some other areas of volunteering does appear to be pulling through. I don't think it's looking at the same challenge. It's the same challenges, but not necessarily the same scale of challenge. And some of the work that we're doing with young people, the Being Young in Scotland survey did show that amongst 11 to 16-year-olds, 46% of them wanted to volunteer in sport and recreation. It's a very popular activity for young people, particularly young people who are wanting to build some skills, to build a CV, to build some credibility and work experience. Volunteering in sport is hugely popular for them, and sport's got a huge amount to get from young people's skills. Their skills around social networking and their reach into their own peer community is far more successful than many maybe traditional volunteers would have been able to achieve. But critically, I think, as Stuart says, requires leadership and focus and an element of mentoring.
And volunteers will be easier to get in certain communities, not necessarily the communities that need the volunteers. So what are the various organisations here who believe that volunteers are essential to this process, they're vitally important to this process, and the sport that will ensue will case better benefit? What are you all doing, working together to ensure that there's recruitment strategies in place for the ongoing recruitment of volunteers? We've seen some examples in the papers that we've received, that Manchester Bureau recruited 2,000 volunteers. We hear lots of positive talk about what the Olympics is going to bring and the volunteering there, the potential for the volunteering in the Commonwealth Games. Is there any evidence that someone who volunteers to participate in the Olympics goes back into the community and volunteers to run a sports club or support or whatever, or be the, so there are definitely significant issues in there, and I'm particularly interested in how we meet the needs of volunteers in communities where the capacity to be the treasurer, to be the chairman, to be anything is simply not there. And as a consequence, there is less activity in these communities. A part of the reason that will be less activity in these areas. So what are you all doing together to ensure that we have the banks of volunteers that we need? Because they come and go, don't they? You need to recruit. Like political parties, we know a bit about this, how difficult it is to get volunteers. Yes, Stuart. Yeah,
have a go at it. I mean, the Paralympics is an interesting one because once they're finished, the databases that LOCOG actually have will be made available, and we should be able to take out the sections that are to do with Scotland and maybe even the north of England. And I think it's one of the things that Lee said earlier on, it will be about contacting these people and asking them. Now, I don't think we can do that from a national perspective. And one of the things that I've spoken to you before and others around the table about our relationship with all 32 local authorities and the work that we're doing collectively there. club and community structure that we have at the moment is, Kim mentioned 13,000 small clubs. One of the things that we're trying to do around community sports hubs is to look at that scale. And we've already got 141 community sports hubs identified, not up and operational yet, but identified. And the principle of that is a number of sports working together. So throughout that, there is leadership, there is a home, whether it be a school, and again, probably we'll come back to schools, and there is the opportunity for a number of sports to work together to support each other to grow, if that's what they are looking for, or just to be sustained, if that's something that's a priority for them. In terms of our work with the SSA, in particular, Kim and Lee work with all the governing bodies, as do we, so there's a job for us all to do to bring those sports together in local communities, regardless of where they are. It could well be, we think there's a huge potential around schools, and secondary schools in particular across Scotland. If I had to be really greedy, and I've already been quoted on this, every single secondary school in Scotland would be a hub of some sort, not just for sport actually, but for other community activity. But that's me being greedy. At the moment, we're at about 70-odd secondary schools.
But what has been done to get that, everybody identified volunteers and all of the submissions that I've had time to read through? Everybody identified that volunteers were absolutely crucial, and the recruitment and support of volunteers was what are we doing in Scotland that's equivalent to the Manchester Bureau of Volunteers? Kim?
I think I would very much echo Stuart's greed there. I think that would be certainly an ambition for everybody around the idea of the community hubs. I think the Manchester legacy from the Commonwealth Games, the big challenge that they identified was, as Stuart's already mentioned, around the database. So they had their 20,000 volunteers. Their big challenge was it took them 2 years to overcome the data protection issues to allow them to contact the volunteers again to actually use them. So that was a big challenge for them. That's already been overcome by the Olympics and the Paralympics, and it's already something that Glasgow 2014 are working through to make sure that doesn't happen. So 2014 are looking for about 15,000 volunteers now. My guess, and certainly my hope, is that they'll get an awful lot more people interested than just those 15,000 who end up being the people who are volunteering at the Games themselves. So I think there's a huge opportunity around everybody else to say, and I know it's something 2014 are already working on, well, maybe there isn't space for you here, but actually are you aware of all these other opportunities in your local community? So I think that's an important part of that. I think around the work that's already ongoing, part of the work that we support our members, as Stuart was saying, is around recruitment of board directors. So around people who are interested in volunteering actually in the governing body at that level. That's our starter. We're a staff of 2. So that's how we're starting to try and support that amongst a network of a range of professional organisations, as Lee was saying, to try and fill some of those challenging governance areas. So that's a bit of initial work on our point of view, from our point of view. However, the governing bodies are doing a huge amount to try and support volunteers through part of the partnership programmes they have with Sport Scotland and the work they do with the local authorities and the local sports councils. So there are some really good examples within orienteering clubs, for example, where a lot of the orienteering clubs, through support provided by the governing body, have a sort of volunteer manager. And that person is responsible for trying to identify new people, trying to, as was the point Nanette made around retention, because I think that's a key opportunity to make sure that people are enjoying what they're doing, that they are having fun, because obviously that's the most important part. So they're doing a lot of work to make sure that people aren't being overburdened, trying to designate roles to different people with different interests. So I think that's a key part of it. But again, that takes people on the ground, which usually are volunteers, to say, well, you know, I'll take that on, I'll try and find new people, I'll try and help people. And I think there is a huge opportunity to tap into younger people, as Stuart and Mary were saying. I volunteered from when I was about 14 myself, so I can absolutely empathise with that, and I think there is a huge potential for that. The governing bodies are doing a lot around coaching and officiating programmes, which again attract a lot of people. I think coaching is quite often, as Lee and Mary were saying, a very high profile perhaps part of volunteering, the bit that people want to be involved in. But the governing bodies, through support with Sport Scotland, have invested a huge amount in supporting coaching structures. And the feedback that so often we've heard from the governing bodies is that the coaches who've been through these programmes feel like they're better coaches. Coming out of those programmes, they've got increased confidence, increased capacity, and feel they're better coaches. And at the end of the day, that's testament to these things working. So there's been a huge amount of work done there. I think your point, convener, about equity and a challenge, I think, for deprived communities is very fair, and that's where volunteering is at its lowest level, certainly in sport, and I'm sure throughout the wider voluntary sector. Again, I think employer-supported volunteering has an opportunity for that. I'm sure the challenge of time is even more exacerbated within those communities, but it's those employers we need to be targeting to say, well, actually, if we want more participation in those communities are able and have the same capacity and skills as everybody else, but they need time perhaps more so than anybody else. If they're working 2 jobs, then time really is a pressure for them. How can we try and release some of that time in order that they can create more capacity and more activity within their communities for the members of those communities?
Anyone else? John Howie, I'll let you. John hasn't been in yet.
Okay, thank you, Convener.
Come back, of course.
With Health Scotland, it probably can be considered less direct, but the 3 key areas that we'd consider to be a helpful resource for volunteers. The first is around generating a confident, skilled volunteer workforce, and so access to our e-learning resources. The whole notion of the future design of community sports hubs has been a health promoting resource as well. So again, access to advice around smoking, health eating, alcohol. I think having that additional resource will be of great benefit to the future design of community sports hubs. Also e-learning resources as well that individuals could tap into in terms of providing support and advice around the benefits of physical activity. The second part is round about marketing the clubs and organisations that are in existence. And the Active Scotland website that is managed by Health Scotland has 2,700 organisations now linked to it. So again, that's a free resource that people can just tap in their postcode and be able to identify where their local clubs are. So again, that's support to the clubs and the volunteers to generate business. The next is around about generating participation, because again, clubs are dependent on getting people to participate in the activities that are on offer. And again, with future developments such as signposting from primary care, we've got a pilot commencing in January, looking at brief advice and interventions where GPs and primary care nurses will be referring or signposting individuals to a range of physical activity options, one being sport. That again is a useful support, and it's going to generate future participation from people who wouldn't normally be participating in activities that would be associated with sport.
Anyone else?
I think one of the other key things is not to regard volunteers as a sort of amorphous blob. They are all very different. The Manchester experience, for instance, was about event volunteers. And they did get a lot of them to come back. Not, by the way, only about sports events. They got them to come back and do arts events and parades and things. But most of those volunteers came back to do other events. They weren't that long-term committed volunteer that is the fundamental lifeblood of a club and organisation, that person who's going to be there. Like I was fortunate, I worked for Sports Scotland. They were wonderful, flexible employees, and I was able to be there at 3:30 on a Tuesday afternoon to do my wife's hockey club, school hockey club. So, that sort of commitment that you do every single Tuesday and every single Saturday and every single Sunday is what you require, and that's a different person, and that I think is a bottom-up process. I think you don't do it from the top. It's about building capacity locally, but you do need to have some support for these. The most effective volunteering in Scotland is probably in colleges and universities, where there is quite a lot of infrastructure and support to help a club operate and to grow treasurers and to grow chairmen and to grow match secretaries. If you don't have that as a natural part of the community or of activity that you're in, you need, I think, to find and support that. So I do think there is a role here probably for local authorities to get amongst these clubs and build that capacity at the lower level, particularly in the governance areas.
Yeah. I'm going to move on, but there's a wee contradiction between the evidence that we had, because you're doing what politicians do, that when you want a volunteer, they've got to be absolutely committed, they've got to be there 5 nights a week and whatever.
Some of them have to be.
And that's totally the wrong message according to the evidence that we've got there, because the evidence that we've got tells us that we need to be specific about what we'd require people to do and give them exit routes, because we know that a lot of these volunteers come in with their children and leave with their children. They're not superheroes. But I think we've also heard here this morning that it's for the employers and for local authorities. And what I asked this morning is, those groups like yourself who are in, have you got a joint strategy that focuses on recruitment of volunteers? And I'm taking from the answers, you can correct me if I'm wrong, that you haven't.
Well,
Mrs. Allison.
I think...
Mary Allison, and I'll let you back in.
We have a framework that's a shared framework with a number of partners nationally and locally, and it sets out clearly the actions that we're going to take to engage volunteers, to support volunteers, and to recognise the efforts of volunteers. It's a very simple framework that sets out clearly what we're doing. So it will tell you what we're doing with Scottish Student Sport as a partner to support the workforce that Lee's talked about, what we're doing through the Active Schools Network with our partners in the Organising Committee of Glasgow 2014 and the Youth Sport Trust. We'll have 2 peer leaders in every school so that they will support their young people, act as role models for volunteering. We will also have a shared portal with Volunteer Development Scotland. We've already started working on that to make sure that people who want to volunteer are very well aware of the opportunities to do that and can easily contact people in sport, but they will also do proactive work in there. So we've set out the measures we'll use, the partners we're working with and the actions in this, and we can easily make that available to the committee.
Yeah, we'll look forward to that future action.
Okay.
But so
the point I was trying to make is
that
that there is a complete range of volunteers. There is some from which you only need maybe a couple of hours a week or a couple of hours a month. There are some where you need maybe 5 to 10 hours a week, depending on the type of role. And the plea I was trying to make was not to regard volunteers as sort of one amorphous thing. They are a complete different section, and the way to recruit and retain them is not the same depending on the role that you're looking for. And it's setting out that purpose and setting out that clarity and doing that leadership that Stuart is talking about, I think. Now, as governing bodies, they nearly all have some volunteer development programme. But in the end, it's going to be down at the individual 13,000 clubs to do their own recruitment, I feel.
It's followed by Bob Doris.
Kim, just touching a bit, is the bureaucracy around becoming a volunteer off-putting? I mean, I remember once having a form to fill in for the WRVS, and it was a huge amount of paper, which I found really quite daunting. Is that the same for people volunteering in sport?
I don't think the problem's for the individual. Sometimes, if you want them to fill out their child protection form, you just hand them the form. The difficulty, again, is with the person who's that, as Kim talks about, who's that volunteer manager or that volunteer organiser. That's where the bureaucracy falls. Not, I don't think, on the individual volunteer, but on the person that's trying to recruit and trying to organise. And that can be off-putting, I think.
I do think, I absolutely agree with that, and I don't think the research, as I understand it, doesn't show that that's off-putting for people at all. But I think what we can do more with that is supporting people, and I think the point that Lee was making is absolutely it. For people, so many people say they don't volunteer because they've never been asked. So who's the person that does the asking? How do we increase that workforce on the ground? If clubs have volunteer managers working with local authorities, I'm sure that's part of why Active School has been so successful in recruiting volunteers. There's somebody out there asking, would you like to volunteer? This is what it looked like. You'll have a great time. Here's what you'll get out of it. So I think that capacity is part of the challenge. But I think these people do need support. And again, I think, if you're looking at a club, it'll be coming and say, here's how we'll help you, we'll make sure it's fun for you and it's easy for you. Equally, if you're an employer, here's how we'll help you, here's how we'll support you. And that people get a chance to, the database that Mary was talking about is exactly it. I know there are a few different examples of it, but that's it. How do we focus people towards that? And that provides them with the information of what it's going to look like, how they get involved. So I don't understand that's the challenges the research shows, but I do still think there is more we can do.
Bob Doris.
Thanks, Convener, and good morning. I'd quite like to move from volunteering to participation, because I suspect there's a chicken and egg aspect to this, which is the more people that participate, the bigger the pool of potential volunteers that you get. I'd like to put some stats on the record in terms of the challenge we've got in making people more physically active and participating in sport. The Let's Make Scotland More Active strategy, dating back to 2003, has a target of 50% of all adults aged over 16 and 80% of all children aged 16 and under meeting the minimum recommended levels of physical activity by 2022. Understand that we haven't captured the under 16 stats on that, but we do have some of the adult stats on that, and they show that in both 2008 and 2010 the figure remained at 39%. So not fantastic, but it's a fairly stagnant baseline on those two stats. But there is some room for optimism, because I did look at that household survey that was referred to previously, and whilst people aren't meeting that target of 5 days a week doing that physical exercise, they are more physically active, because in 2009-10, 72% were physically active in a significant way in the last month, and that increased in 10-11 to 75%. So perhaps beneath the tip of that iceberg of inactivity, there's more activity, we're just not quite reaching that 5 days a week. So a huge challenge there, some signs for optimism, but when you look at it, there are significant inequalities in the levels of participation, and that's really the beef of where my kind of question goes. And looking at the data made available to this committee, it would appear to be 3 main areas. I'm sure there's more. First of all, those in urban areas are less likely to participate in sport than those in rural areas. Those in deprived communities, quite often indeed in urban areas, are less likely to participate in sport than those not in deprived areas. And females, there's a significant gender gap in sports participation. So what I would be quite keen to know, and that actually echoes a lot of the health inequalities, and I know we've got Health Improvement Scotland here as well in society, what I would quite like to know is what the strategy is, whether it's via community sports hubs, whether it's via a volunteer strategy, whether it's Health Improvement Scotland signposting people, what the strategy is to increase sports participation. Generally, yes, to be keen to know that, but what I don't want is fit, healthy people doing more exercise, although that would be good. I want those that are unfit and not healthy to start doing exercise. So what's the strategy to address these 3 significant inequalities?
Thank you. I mean, a range of points there, and very well made. I mean, in terms of looking at the stats of where we are with children, you're right, it's an 80% target for 2022 to be engaged in the minimum levels of physical activity per week. The data that we're currently holding from the Scottish Health Survey was that 72% of children, which is including school activities, were meeting that target. 75% boys, 70% girls. As you'll be aware, there's new guidelines being laid out in terms of what's required on a weekly basis. We've now got a whole range of activity levels across the life stages. 180 minutes, 7 days a week for unaided preschool children. 60 minutes, 7 days a week for school children. Still the 5 days a week of 30 minutes for adults, and still for 65 plus as well, with some additional advice around activities around muscle and bone strength and general strength and balance training. So in terms of children, it's encouraging, and it also underlines the role that schools have got to play in terms of how the physical activities levels rise with the inclusion of school-based activities. I think also in terms of the population groups that you've highlighted, they've been well rehearsed in terms of what we know, and of course it's encouraged a range of different interventions in the past in terms of targeted interventions. Just thinking of females and indeed teenage girls, the girls project, Girls on the Move project, which was a significant investment of just over £1 million between 2005-2011, with just small grants going to community groups, generated significant benefits. 62% of participants were more active. A third of those were from the most deprived areas. So again, with targeted small investments into populations where we know needs are greatest, and through a range of different supports with trained local staff, that can have a major impact. What would be keen, though, is that success is repeated throughout the country, and we've not got small pockets of very good practice, that we're seeing that range of activity happening more broadly. And in terms of how we do that, certainly the work that's going on recently, building on the Scottish Charter for Physical Activity, is actually looking at a framework for physical activity that will look at a range of different interventions in terms of how we design our environments, activities within the workplace, within education, how we look at planning arrangements as well, which will all contribute to different levels of physical activity throughout the day. That work's ongoing just now, and I think it's going to be critical in terms of how we pool the various activities that are required to ensure a more active nation, and it's activities that you engage in during the day and not just specific sporting activities. But part of that will be sport. Sport and active recreation is a significant part of this overall framework. And what we're wanting to ensure by working together is how we focus on those populations who are less likely to engage in any form of activity, and indeed those that are less likely to engage in sport.
I'd just like to talk about the very early age group, because the foundation of our ability to participate in any form of physical activity or sport is laid in the very early years of life. And one of the big initiatives that we have been supporting over the last few years, alongside the government campaigns of Play, Talk, Read, is the Play at Home initiative, which is working through health visitors and nurseries to support active play, both in the under ones, toddlers, and in the preschool years. So we have done a first stage evaluation of that, which does show small but modest gains in basic motor skills in toddlers. So there's something there that's a universal program which we're trying to sort of steadily build in, but it goes, the books go to most children in the under ones, and we're steadily building up the nursery age capacity. So there's a national rollout program based on a program from New Zealand that is now in place.
Anybody else? Mary Ellison?
I think across, the two organisations, we're reasonably clear that the real skills the NHS can bring to this are the reaching the completely inactive, the people who really, as an adult, have not been active maybe for some time and may have issues of confidence in choosing activities. Where we're focusing on in Sport Scotland is trying to actually prepare that young people and that young cohort for the future, to really maximise the chances of them maintaining an active life for the future. And looking at some of the inequalities within that. So some of our work around Fit for Girls, partnering some of the work with Girls on the Move, has focused very clearly on the issue that we know emerges in those teenage years, and that we know we can do more. And we've learned now from the Fit for Girls project about what more we can do through the Active Schools Network and through physical education to better engage with teenage girls and better meet their needs. So rather than seeing them as the problem, actually seeing the services that we're providing them with sometimes as the issue, and that's the thing that needs to change. And we've been quite effective in working with schools to change some of those through good leadership in schools, I have to say as well, and good buy-in from head teachers to champion the need to do things like that for girls, not to assume that one size will fit all in a secondary school environment. So the focus of our energy is really going into making sure that we are maximising the chances for young people to get the right kinds of skills, confidence, environment, to see them through a longer period of life. And we know that for young people who go into further or higher education, they are far more likely to maintain an active life and maintain it for life. So there are clearly things in that environment that we're also working with Scottish Student Sport, who now covers further and higher education. And that's reaching a far wider number of young people post-school years. But undoubtedly, again, the connection between things like Paths to Health, which is very much an NHS-partnered focus activity, and then us joining onto that with things like the work through Scottish Athletics and Jog Scotland, or through Scottish Swimming, helping the very basic level of adult swimming just for health and fitness. So appropriately, I think, involving at times specific sports, but not overstretching or overclaiming the impact that sport-specific clubs can have in dealing with all issues of inactivity. We're very clear it can make a major contribution, but can't solve every issue of inactivity, because, as John and Anne have said, it takes a much wider joined-up effort across transport, across health, across the environments that we live in, to support people to have a more active life. And that 30 minutes a day of moderate activity is unlikely to come in any circumstance anywhere in the world entirely from sport. It will be made up of a mix of sport and other ways of living actively.
Atkinson, I think, wants in, Bob.
Just around I know the equality again was a question. and wholeheartedly agree really with what Anne was saying in terms of if we're going to provide that equitable baseline for people to participate in sport, I think it is around sport within schools, and I know there's a huge amount of work going on in that regard. If every young person leave school with the belief that, and I guess that sport is that cultural norm, that taking part in sport and physical recreation is just a normal part of daily life, then I think, you know, you're setting a framework there. If they believe that sport is fun and have the confidence to take part, which is one of the points that Anne made, then again, I think that's a key strand. And I think the third part is what's so commonly referred to as physical literacy. So if you can run, jump, throw, catch and swim. If every young person leaves primary school with those three things, then I think you've set that foundation. Now, that's not to say there isn't work to be done elsewhere, but I think you set that foundation of everybody having that same chance to start with. But I do think some of the specific interventions that John and Anne spoke about make a huge difference, and I think they're really important about expanding on where we know, as you say, that best practice exists. How do we replicate that? The Jog Scotland programme that Mary mentioned is a great example of that, and I know swimming and a number of other organisations support that and a number of our governing bodies. But the Jog Scotland programme, people start by walking. So it's those interventions where people who aren't active at all can start to get active in a way where it is friendly, it is fun, there are people you can go along with. You know, it does make it easy for people, but you don't have to be fit to start. There are programmes that start to get you fit, if that makes sense. And I think that's a huge opportunity. But it's about those programmes, those specific interventions, then leading into club sport. People who participate as one of the members of the 13,000 Sports Club participate more often and for longer than people who participate out with the club structure. So clubs on their own provide that basis, so that's a huge opportunity in their own right. But also the fun and social activities that sport provide. I'm sure when you speak to Sir Harry Burns shortly, he'll say the same. But that social connectedness and social activity that are provided through sporting club networks, again, provide a huge benefit. The cross-party group on sport meets this evening, as I know you're aware, and again, there'll be a few good examples. The Active Communities programme, which is a Jog Scotland part of their jogging, what used to be Jogging Buddies, is a good example of some of those. So we'll be able to send on information from that. But there are a number of case studies in there this evening through Atlantis Leisure and the Trice Community Sports Club, again, just about how local communities themselves have got involved, found out the needs of their communities and tried to, you know, reflect those not only in terms of increasing participation and opportunities, but those associated benefits that sport provides.
There's been lots of examples of practice there, but I think in terms of sustaining participation and growing participation, it's about that integrated provision. You know, the previous inquiry, Pathways into Sport, talked about that. That was one of the recommendations. We've certainly taken it on board. Good practice is telling us now that Sport Scotland, the local authority and its agencies, the NHS, have to be working together strategically, as we do nationally. I know you commented on that earlier, Convener. We do actually work together. But locally, I think it's critical because participation growth is supported there. That is where it's about sustainable infrastructure. I'll go back to my use of schools, the use of, there's a whole range of facilities there, whether it be private, publicly owned, and if we can look at that provision strategically in supporting growth of participation and new participation, and also sustaining existing, that's the way forward. It won't happen on its own with small projects.
It all sounds very worthy examples that you're given, but I should expect politicians to say is we want to map it out somehow and quantify success. You know, usually politicians move away from targets, but in this case maybe targets are actually quite important. You know, raw data to show how many sports clubs there are who tailor their activities for females who exist in deprived areas. Is there any mapping exercise underway so in 2 years' time or 3 years' time we can say this has been wonderfully successful, as I hope we are able to say, but equally we have to be able to say if it hasn't been successful, how we're going to change our approach and our direction. So what data are we seeking to collect in the next couple of years to see, again, I'll go back to not just general participation, because increased general participation can mask growing inequalities in health and physical participation. So those urban settings, deprived areas and gender inequalities, what attempts have been made to kind of capture progress in these areas?
Mary Allison, yes, thanks. And Anne Kerr, I think, wants, you want an Anne? Right, thanks.
Okay, I mean, through our programme Active Schools, we are constantly monitoring the range that's on offer, the uptake, and amongst different schools, and we're reflecting that back to the network. Our main goal is actually to collect that data to reflect back to them. Are you clear this is what is going on your patch? And are you clear that there's an active school coordinator around there who's done some very innovative work and has managed to get this figure up here? And getting them together, networking and sharing practice is a big part of what we're doing and have done for some time in the Active Schools Network. We're now replicating some of that for the community sports hubs, and we're gathering very similar data in a very similar way to share back to those community hub leaders. Now obviously that work is community-led, and we can't from the centre dictate what needs to be provided in that community or even tell them that they must provide certain forms of activity. We're responding to their community's desire to provide for their community, but we are reflecting back to them in their data, this is what you're achieving. This is the range of activities, these are the range of groups involved, and we're doing that year on year so that they can see the trends. We're bringing them together to learn from other hubs. And again, the principal reason for that is to be able to show them, somebody in Dundee's managed to achieve this, you've been struggling with that, why don't you go and look at what they've done? So our whole point of the monitoring data is, yes, to keep an eye on it from a national perspective, but principally it's to feed back to them and show them where the best emerging practice is to solve the type of issues that they have in their community, so that we're not shaping the agenda entirely.
I just want a final comment rather than another question. It would be, sorry, does someone else want to come in? My apologies, Anne.
I think you're absolutely right. We do need to know that it goes beyond just participation and who is participating, and that it's sustained. And I think we're at the stage where we have done that with small projects, with specialist projects, with targeted projects, doing that on a wider scale to see that actually across a whole area that we're actually reaching the deprived groups, or that we're actually reaching a particular group of young women, is very time-consuming. To us, people who have been growing participation over the last few years, have been putting huge effort into growing participation, and getting that to start to say, well, actually, we need this bit of information and this bit of information, that bit of information, is a big challenge. So I think it is a challenge that we need to be addressing, to say, what have we learnt from the small specialist projects? How can we adapt that so that it is done easily, that people can record for themselves, they can log in when they turn up, so there isn't a great deal of effort to pull out that actually we're reaching the deprived community, we're actually getting 14-year-old girls to come and participate for the length of the course. So we've done it for specialist work, and the challenge is now to work out how to do that efficiently on a wider basis.
I just wanted to say thank you for your answers. It would be quite good if there was more information, even in written form, just about how you seek to grab that data, obviously in a non-bureaucratic way, because the physical activity in the sport is more important than collecting the data. But that would be useful. It would be quite important to this committee or a future committee to be able to map out the successes, let's say not or otherwise, just the successes, because particularly with the potential health benefits of that as well, it will certainly increase your arguments for greater funding if we can start to see some of those successes mapped out. And thank you for your time.
Richard Simpson, followed by Richard Lyon.
I wanted to pursue an area that was mentioned earlier, and that is the comparisons with other countries. In terms of the size of sports clubs, if I've got the figures right, we've got 13,000 clubs at the moment. There are about 3,000, about a quarter of them are registered with the Sports Association. And they presumably then feed into the sports governing bodies. But the comparison was much bigger size in other countries, which obviously gives you a much easier approach to governance, I suspect. Because my calculation would be if you've got 13,000 clubs, you're going to need about 50,000 people just to be the treasurer, chairman and secretary. That's a hell of a lot of volunteers just to deal with very basic governance issues. So we seem to be pinning our hopes on the community sports hubs, but how are they actually bringing these small clubs together to try and help them with governance issues and help them with ensuring that they can then recruit volunteers, and that the volunteers they're recruiting aren't engaged in chairman, secretary and treasurer, which frankly many people in sports don't want to be that engaged in. How are we actually making this a much more efficient system?
Yes,
Richard, it's a good question, and I think one of the things that we're looking at in terms of the outcome of growing participation and growing the infrastructure for sport is based on the Community Sport Hub principles. Now, the management of it, I'm just going to go back to the Trice Community Sports Hub in Larbert, where we have huge collaboration from a range of small clubs who were all previously dotted about the area, a big secondary school, a golf club, a cricket club, and a football club. Now, we've managed to bring all of that together. Now, I'm going back to the leadership question here. The management group that's now running that club includes the head teacher of the secondary school and the director from the football club. For me, it's really exciting because we have 9 sports now who were all previously working independently, working together, and the growth, now we need to see it sustained, but the growth in participation, there's almost 800 young people are now participating across a range of those sports. That's exciting. The collaboration is a key point, and the fact that they can call the school and the other associated facilities around it their home. That is what they would call their home, rather than being nomadic as such as clubs. So there are some real exciting things around community sports hubs which are based on the principle of growing participation, sustaining that effort and collaboration through people, and critically making the facility in the community accessible. For that club to grow, though, they need greater access to the time in the school. At the moment, they can't get a lot of access at weekends, and they can't get a lot of access in the later evening. Again, if I was Grady convener, I'd be making that club responsible for that entire school and that community responsible for a range of sports and its own destiny.
So why is there a problem at the weekends and the evenings?
Due to the PPP contract, usually. Sometimes it's due to other contracts with other groups, and sometimes it takes time to break down all of that and bring it together. So sometimes it's as simple as encouraging a group that may be working on its own to be part of that greater collective. But often it's to do with the contract or to do with the accessibility to the facility at certain times. It's something we're working on. We in Sports Scotland are looking at the access to schools. We've got a study with all 32 local authorities now looking at the exact situation in every school in Scotland. The findings of that will be really important.
According to your evidence, that's due at the end of the year. Have you any interim work that you've discussed that can be shared with the committee? Or?
We don't at this stage. We're still. There are a number of local authorities where we have all the data we require. There are a number where we have most but not all, and there are a few where we're still in negotiation about the information, its quality and need. So it would be better
that any assistance there at all. But I mean, it would be interesting for the committee in terms of its inquiry to have that information. So if you could maybe let us know who you need more information from and whatever, that might be something that we could consider as a committee that would push that along.
Just one point just to finish on that. I mean, the reason we did that study was there was lots of general statements about schools not being open. What we'd rather do is find out what the specific situation is in each authority and in each school so that we can then address it with the local authorities. But there's no doubt that our existing capacity in schools does offer us potential for growth, but we have to free it up.
Raised the issue originally about the size of clubs. Why are our clubs so small and in other countries they're huge?
I think part of it is what Stuart mentioned, and that's stability of having a home and having a facility. A lot of our more secure clubs in the sort of bowling, tennis, and golf are some of our larger clubs because they have a home and they have a long-term occupation and of that home. A lot of our clubs, hockey clubs, basketball clubs, hall sport clubs in particular, don't have that stability of a home, and therefore the ability to do long-term planning. And one of the key things I think about the weakness of our clubs and volunteers is their continuity planning. their succession planning, which they tend to be very weak at. And it's very difficult to get into that mode, I think, of long-term thinking if you don't have that basic stability of where you're going to be next year and whether you've got that school next term. And so I think there's quite a lot of that. The other thing, I suppose, which would make us slightly different from some of our continental neighbours, is just the sheer breadth of sports that we have. One of the things that defines, I think, Scottish, if not UK sport, is just that diversity. You know, we tend to try and do 50, 60, 70 activities. Some of the continental countries are probably only down around 20, and that sort of thing. So, and that obviously dissipates membership and changes membership. You would also get the case, I think, too, where a lot of our clubs are, as Stuart said, they are single sports clubs. In other words, whereas some of the continental clubs that you might think will be 4 or 5 sports in one location, in one place. And as you say, the governance requirements are reduced, if you understand me, because you only need one president of 5 or 6 different sports in one place, as opposed to us having 5 or 6, the equivalent 5 or 6 sports in 5 or 6 different places.
So will the hubs help this?
Absolutely. I mean, as I said, we've got 9 sports. There are other hubs that are already showing exciting results already with double-figure sports, where these sports were working individually. If I was greedy again, I'll say it again, I think we should consider, between us, whether it be nationally and locally, whether we make every single secondary school in Scotland a sport hub. And if we look at what's happened in Larbert High School with Stennismuir and other sports clubs around it, if that was replicated, I think we'd see a fantastically different situation in Scotland. But it will take commitment nationally, and it will take commitment locally for that to happen.
There has been some evidence, just to complete this, Richard Lyles coming in now, but you know, there's some evidence where people are saying generally sports hubs are a good idea, but you know, they can become a barrier to a more casual, you know, access, and they can be, you know, some of the evidence that we have reflects that. What would you say to that?
In the community
it's become very formal, and you know, the informal engagement with sport and activity, then you know, it's like the gym, and people with the lycra, the people who should be going to the gym have not got like, I'm not going near that place. It becomes you know, overly you know, sporty, and people that's not the entry point they would have. You know, there's a bit of elitism there. There's you know.
Yeah, I mean, it's again, we're trying not to make one intervention or one. It's not one size fits all, convener. But what we are seeing, and again, this is from experience in Calder Glen, in South Lanarkshire. Yes, there's the formal sport, but just because it's a basketball club doesn't mean to say it's that formal. It can actually be quite recreational. But we're looking at attaching walking clubs, jogging clubs, swimming clubs, just recreational activity. Older age groups can be, and I think we are trying to tackle this on a growth model, not on let's try and do everything at once. Let's try and build it in a sustainable, manageable way. So whilst I can understand those kind of comments, it shouldn't deflect us from that, I think, strategic approach, which says build this in a sustainable way. But it is absolutely possible to have activity groups attached and having their home in a community sports hub.
And Kia?
There's also something there about open access. I mean, if we have school estates, how many of them are completely closed off and not accessible to the public out of hours, even to just have a knockabout game of some sort? There's that sort of openness. We also have a fantastic inheritance of public parks that the Victorians built. How easy is it to access the pitches, the courts, just for a knockabout? It's that sort of thing that we could be looking at.
Okay. Richard Lyle.
Thank you, Convener. Can I welcome you all this morning, and thank you for a very informative past hour. I have 2 specific questions, and I think, and aiming the first one at you, Stuart, and I have to say, be greedy. As far as I'm concerned, in regard to community hubs, I welcome the investment the Scottish Government has made, and I welcome the commitment you've got. But is it enough? My experience is that when it comes to schools, some people believe that your hub is going to take the school over or take the park over. Yes, we have a lot of parks. which are unused, and I'll come back to that in a minute, in my second question. But basically, if we had a sports hub in every town, or as you say, maybe every secondary school, that we could concentrate all these clubs together, because locally we've got sports councils, local council, local authorities, Sports Scotland, Scottish Sports Councils, NHS. I don't feel as though we're getting... Everybody's doing a lot of good work, and I compliment you what you're doing, but I don't feel there's joined up working between everybody. So a local sports hub, would that join up all these, make a place where everyone could go? Because, again, in my experience, you've got a lot of clubs out there who don't even know who to contact, or don't even know who the other club is in the next town. You know, because you've got what they call the Data Protection Act, and the minute you phone up and they say, oh no, that's in the Data Protection Act, we can't give you that information. So what more could we do to join up, make joined up working?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely vital. There's no choice. I think all local agencies, along with ourselves, need to work together with an integrated plan for growing participation and actually improving standards of coaching, facilities, performance. It's not enough. I agree with you. Our investment in community sports hubs has been a starter for 10. What we will do is look to expand that and develop it. We're also beginning to look at how we might support sport-specific clubs to grow in their own homes. So we think this area, call it the legacy of the Commonwealth Games and Olympics, if you would, but I would probably suggest that this is something that we're using those two major games to really accelerate our ambition to make sport a part of everyday life and to grow it so that people can experience it for whatever reason, just to have a bit of fun and have some social time with friends, or to be the best they can be. So I think that Sports Scotland will certainly be, and we really value our partnerships with local government. I need to stress that. Sports Scotland many years ago had a relationship with only a few. Now we have a very strong strategic relationship with all 32, which offers us a chance to get into that hard-nosed, what are our assets, how do we use them collectively for the greater good?
They are a lot, Adams, and we might come back to this, but arm's length and about how we sustain those assets as well and maintain them and the cost of them and all of that we've had raised some concerns with too. Lee Cousins?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that I do think there's a role for community sports hubs in the information sense, that they are places where you could advertise volunteering opportunities, you could advertise volunteering requirements. They are places where I think you can share knowledge around the local clubs in your area. So I just wouldn't, as well as providing a home for clubs and adding activities, we shouldn't forget their ability, I think, to share and pass information. And I hope that will be quite a strong part of what they are. In other words, back to, I think, somewhat that Stuart said, these are community hubs as well as community sports hubs in that sense.
Can I come back in? Comes on really well back into the point you made earlier, Lee. Time, the volunteers. But there's one thing we're forgetting: the cost of being a volunteer, and the cost of, particularly the point Anne was making, the cost of premises. We have 32 local authorities. We have various trusts, various leisure facilities. When my son tells me that to hire a hall for volleyball is £40 an hour, they've now moved to a school, you'll love that one, because of the cost. So the cost of being a volunteer, thousands of people doing a lot of good work, but have to collect their £1 or their £2 or whatever off the kids every week to pay for the playing facilities, the park or whatever. So what can we do to regulise the cost of being or reduce the cost of being a volunteer? Even put the disclosure, if I think it costs about £40–50 or round about that sort of, to fill in your form. That's the cost of being a volunteer. And that discourages a lot of people because, again, the point that Bob made earlier, a lot of people come from disadvantaged areas that they want to do things. They want to go to the park, to play football, but they can't pay the 40 quid or the 30 quid or the whatever that has been asked to rent it. So what can we do to look at that, to reduce the cost of being a volunteer?
Just one correction there. For a volunteer in sport, the CRB check is free. It doesn't cost.
I stand corrected.
That's one of the nice policy things that happens.
Does anyone want to respond to some of the evidence suggests that cost is not one of the highest barriers? But Mary Allison?
Yeah. I mean, we monitor charges for sports facilities every year, and we have done for the last decade in Sport Scotland. And in the last year, which you would expect, you know, to see some real pressure points, the majority of sports facility charges have gone up less than the cost of the retail price index. So the rate at which cost of sport is going up is less than the cost of many other activities. In some cases it hasn't gone up at all. So if you look at things like aerobics, keep fit sessions per session, there was a percentage change of 0.1%. Although undoubtedly for some groups in some places at some facilities that will be there, across Scotland as a whole there is still a relatively stable charging position, which has not changed significantly over many years.
Can you share some of that information
We
with
can,
ensure
we
the committee
certainly
get
can.
that for the
Yeah.
wider discussion? I think it'd be useful, Richard.
Yeah.
To
and maybe
follow up.
additionally, just to comment on the cost of training as a volunteer, to get a coaching award, like a level 1 coaching award, which would be the kind of very basic entry point into coaching, there's a significant amount of subsidy and in most cases free by the time you can apply for the various sources of funds. Possibly one of the things we can all get better at is making sure all that information's out there for people, but certainly the service and the subsidy is there.
Yes, Kim Atkinson.
I think the joined up working is absolutely the heart of it, and I think there's a huge amount of work being done, and that's not to say there isn't more, because I think we can always strive to improve. But we work on behalf of the governing bodies, so just as a point of clarity, we're the representative body for the governing bodies for the different sports in Scotland. So there are 13,000 sports clubs, the vast majority of which are members of the governing body. I think the 3,000 figure that Richard quoted, I think, came from the SPICE briefing, which was about the Scottish Association of Local Sports Councils. Ollie Barsby, I think, is in your next session, so I'm sure he can provide clarity on that. However, we work very closely with SALSC and with Scottish Student Sport, and that's been a collaboration, obviously, between the governing bodies, the universities and the local sports councils to say, well, actually, this word legacy is bandied about quite a lot. What would that be? And community sports hubs are a key strand of that and a key opportunity. The three areas that those three collective bodies on behalf of their members came up with was the 2 hours of quality PE, so that physical literacy, regular activity, the better support for coaches and volunteers, which I know we've spent a lot of time talking about today, but the other part was around places. So it was better use of existing facilities, and as Mary said, I don't think facilities have to be expensive, and I think there's a lot of facilities out there with a small amount of investment can really make a difference, and whether that's opening up existing estates, and that's particularly obviously the schools, but obviously looking at the natural resources that we have out there in the natural environment. There are a huge number of ways that people can get active, which are accessible from that point of view. So I think the working together is a huge part of that. I think the local authorities have a key strand in that, and I'm sure they'll agree with that themselves. The assets and the opportunities that they present with having a local base, as we spoke about earlier, in terms of how we recruit people and get people involved. You've got local capacity there, but also that 90% of funding in sport in Scotland goes through local authorities. 90%. So that's a particularly significant part. But I think working all together is the most important part. I know we're all striving to do more, and I think there is more that we can do.
And Keir.
I've been hearing the points about collaboration and the examples that are happening around community sports hubs, but I think I'd like to draw attention to some of the partnerships that are developing between local authorities and health boards. They are different across the country. Sometimes it might be a healthy weight strategy, sometimes it might be a council sports strategy, or it might be a health board's physical activity strategy. I think particularly, say, Tayside has got a very good example where they collaborate across sectors on a physical activity strategy, which brings together some of these partners to improve that dialogue, which should address some of the issues around equity and variability locally about access.
The question that I'm interested in is that we know that's happening in local areas and within health board areas, and even within that it will be different. How would those partnerships between the local authority and the health board be improved by the expertise that is around it? How are they all linked in?
We have two sort of link-in forms around physical activity and health. One is that we have a special interest group which takes a lead for physical activity from each health board. So they as a group come together to share practice and information, respond to consultations and so on. We then have a wider physical activity and health alliance, which is a much broader cross-sectoral group. It's about 900 strong, and our annual conference is actually next week in Murrayfield, and we expect to get about 300, so about a third of that active membership. It cuts across health board staff in particular. We get a lot of active schools coordinators involved in that. So there's a good mix, a few scattering of academics and things. So there's a good mix in there for sharing practice.
Yeah. I'm not, you know, it's admirable all this, but it doesn't reassure me. But there's, all of these people are doing, you know, looking for that outcome and that improved outcome, increased activity, a fitter your society with all the benefits that can bring to physical health and mental health. I'm just, you know, it may be the hangover of going through all the papers and all of the submissions, but by Jove, there seems to be a hang of a lot of people doing the same thing. When what's available to us in physical resources and finance is very, very precious indeed. You know, it's just an observation, but I think, you know, the connections could be better. John, do you want to respond to that?
I mean, I think you're right. I mean, that there's massive effective practice spread across the country, and as quoted on the strategy. I've just recently looked at Inverclyde's physical activity strategy as well. It's a very good example of partners working closely together to deliver on what we know requires to be delivered. There's no argument around physical activity. We know the importance of it in terms of the impact on the health and well-being of Scotland. We've got an excellent policy in terms of let's make Scotland more active. It was reviewed after 5 years, and the same messages were reinforced. There was clearly points highlighted where we needed to improve. I think the challenge is at collective delivery at a national level, and to see a consistent delivery across all local areas. And that has been the work that's been developed over the last year, building on the Toronto Charter for Physical Activity. We've developed our own Scottish Charter, which is a grassroots origins of the range of different of deliverables we want to see in place. And currently we're working on a framework that will pull these various strands of activity together at a national level and look at ways and means of a more consistent delivery of local intervention. So I think we're at a stage now where we recognise that there is a need for a more collaborative national mechanism for delivering on the range of activities that we need to deliver on around active living and improving the rates of physical activity.
Stuart Harris before I take Drew Smith and then Jim Eadie.
Vivian, I'll try and reassure you a little bit around the strategic position. There is, in my mind, with what I'm seeing and what I'm experiencing around local authority areas, it's way better than it was. It's still not as good as it could be, but it's better than it was. What's the key to that? It's about each organisation being very clear on which bit it does, and some leadership, which I'm still putting in the responsibility of the local authority, to provide that local leadership to make sure that agencies and partners are doing their piece and not duplicating. We just completed a strategy in Shetland. We've had about 6 attempts at getting a strategy. For the first time now, I think we've got one that's been signed off at every level, at the highest level, and is very clear about who does what. And I'm excited about that because I think we can eradicate a lot of the duplication. It's very easy to talk about projects and programmes, but the strategic context, I think, in my view, my experience in the last half a dozen years, is way better than it was, but still room for improvement.
Drew Smith, followed by Jim Eadie.
Thank you, Convener. I think Kim Atkinson makes the pertinent point that 90% of the funding is through local authorities, but there is the element of national spend as well. And I think from the SPICE paper, we can see from 2007, 46 million to Sport Scotland rising to 49 and now down to 38, which raises the immediate question of what don't we do now that we used to with that money, but rather than having that across the board at Sport Scotland, in relation to community sport, then how have the proportions changed in terms of what you're spending from the money that you get? What proportion is directly about community sport, and how has that changed as a result of it?
The budget, obviously we'd like to retain the 48. If that was the figure, you would love to retain that, so put that on the record. But Sport Scotland is an interesting position. It's a lottery distributor as well. And I think members will all be aware that lottery proceeds have actually been going very well. So we have been trying to manage that strategically and make sure that with our total pot of money, which usually is between 60 to 70 million pounds, we try and support as much activity as we can. We're also trying to be quite strong in making decisions about what are priorities and what aren't. For example, Active Schools has now been in place for nearly 10 years. That is #1 priority and has been in the budget for a significant amount of time. And it's important that agencies such as ourselves do that, and we actually make sure we fund the areas that are really critical and key as priorities. And at times where things are tough, maybe lose some of the nice to-dos around the edges. We are very committed to a systematic approach to sport that is world-class. It's ambitious. I know sometimes there's a huge debate about this whole world-class word. But whether it's just walking, running, jogging, it's important that we have that ambition. The resources are key, and I think for me, one of the things that we're doing, Drew, is talking to each authority about what our commitment nationally will be, trying to guarantee that over a 3 or 4 year period, not just a single year or a single application. So the strategic approach is much more stable, and that the local agencies can plan with much more certainty. Equally, we're asking them the same question. You know, rather than just commit on a year-to-year basis for Active Schools, we want a 4-year commitment on Active Schools from local government. And to an extent, we've received those commitments. So balancing resources is always a challenge, but we're quite fortunate in as much as we have government commitment and also lottery resources to draw on. The balance around performance and community, I think, is beginning to swing the way of community, because we've got a system which supports high performance, which is around about £50 million between ourselves and governing bodies. But our ambition with new monies and with existing lottery monies is to really enhance the community offer with local government in the next half a dozen years. And hopefully in the next few months, we'll be able to announce some of those things.
Because I suppose there's a tension with something like Active Schools around your funding partners, essentially, with local authorities with that. And I appreciate your funding will be in lots of different ways in terms of the training and the information you provide and the resources and all of that sort of thing. I guess what I'm interested in, if we look then towards community sports hubs, I'm guessing that it won't be essential in every case that there is an element of national funding in that, but is it the case that you would normally expect there will be some kind of national support provided when a community sports hub is created?
Yeah, there is an allocation for each one. It's quite flexible, because the aim at the end of the day is that community sports hub becomes sustainable. Now that's challenging. Let me give you an example. I was just talking, these figures might not be completely accurate, but a calculation on the Trice Community Sports Hub it would take approximately £50,000 per annum for that to be sustainable. Okay, so that's the ask on that group. Now, currently we're providing something towards that, the football club, the local authority, there's lots of different contributors. But over a period of time, we would hope, and we're not setting a figure on it yet, we'll go as long as needs be to make it sustainable. But that's the aim, so we can then move that around. The UK government, though, this is probably one thing just as important, have changed the shares again of lottery. So we do expect to get some additional resource back into sport, fantastic, which we will use primarily for community and also the outdoor. Kim mentioned that. We think there's some real potential in trying to develop the outdoor dimension of what Sport Scotland does.
So, brief as I can, sorry Duncan, but in terms of the community sports hubs that we have planned, I think now up to 150 in the overall plan, 22 delivered so far. Why are they where they are, and given that there is national spend connected in here? Because from the list I've got here, we've got 3 planned in Glasgow, 3 planned in Inverclyde, 3 planned in Renfrewshire versus 6 in Stirling, 3 in Clackmannanshire. So 3 in Clackmannanshire versus 3 in Glasgow. It doesn't seem, you know, hugely. I understand that there'll be different factors in that,
Yeah.
but in terms of we're spending national money here, why are we spending it in such a divergent way?
Well, what we've tried to do is put an allocation into each authority. We've based that on a formula, which is based on a minimum amount. So even a small authority like Clackmannanshire would get a minimum amount, and the rest based on population. And what we've actually tried to do is to leave the decision making on what each authority in that area is trying to do. So the selection of the community sports hubs is a local decision, and they're very much in that domain. So it's their choice. Now, the potential for growth, Drew, I think, in areas such as Glasgow, in North Lanarkshire, and some of the bigger population areas is fantastic. But again, we can't do all at once. We're trying to learn as many lessons as we can. Glasgow also have a huge amount of other things going on. So there's differences, probably a customised approach that we have with each authority. We think that if the signs continue the way they are, there will be some real growth across this, with local authorities and other agencies looking at where they put their existing resource and how they might better support more community sports hubs across the piece.
I appreciate that, and of course there's other investment going on in Glasgow, and I wouldn't deny that, but you wouldn't necessarily make that argument about Inverclyde and about Renfrewshire, and it just strikes me as strange that it's fine to be community-led if the funding is coming at a community level, but this is national spend then that we're talking about being spent.
But it's only a part of that.
Fairly divergent way, because if you're saying that your approach is that you want it to be community-led and you'll respond to essentially then the demands within the communities, then surely you're merely spending your money to support the areas that have got the highest demand, which are the areas perhaps that might already have the highest levels of participation.
Yeah, you could say that, but I mean, I guess one of the other ambitions for us was to get this movement across the entire nation. So we wanted to take every local authority with us. And we will look again at demand. There's absolutely no doubt about that, and we will find other resources to try and meet that demand. But I think it's important. One of the things that we've tried to do in Sport Scotland is to try and take these infrastructure ideas to every part of the country, not just to pilot it, to let everyone be part of the pilot, and then think about demand and growth beyond that, depending on how people have dealt with it going forward. So we'll take our time to look at who's learning what, where the demand is, and how we might accelerate growth in each of those areas. But it is very much a customised approach with some national resources which are being offset by local and actually community resources as well. The communities are putting a lot in themselves as well as the local agencies.
Could I just ask maybe one final thing on a kind of related issue around cashback for communities? There might be one person that wants to comment on it, but some reflections on who benefits from cashback for communities. I mean, I think there's a general issue raised in some of the papers we've got about how it works and does it work in terms of the difficulties of getting monies from the justice services, how quickly it comes through. But I suppose the key question I wanted to ask around it is, do we have a clear idea of can we follow the pound in terms of where the money comes from and where it's spent?
I think there are some really good examples, and I know the 5 multi-sport model are still compiling some of the research, so there's some good practice there. I think there have been, each programme has dealt slightly differently. So initially it was obviously football, rugby and basketball were the first 3, then there was the 5 multi-sport model. I know the boxing are involved at the moment as well. So each of those phases, for want of a better phrase, has taken a slightly different approach and had slightly different either opportunities or boundaries within which they operate. So there are different examples coming out of them. I know some of the basketball examples just happen to be some of the ones we know best, give some really, really strong results about the partnerships they've created. But through some of the success has been in the way they've delivered slightly differently, but in the way that they've been allowed to use that investment as part of different sets of partnerships, and partnerships with schools and partnerships with clubs, to try and make sure that they really are attracting as broad a range of young people as they can, but their retention figures and their increased participation figures in supporting a range of new clubs as well, new clubs in new areas, have really been quite impressive. But I realise quite a lot of the research, as I say, is still being compiled at the moment, but I've got some figures on the basketball stuff that we can send to you if that helps, and I know football have been doing quite a lot as well, so I'm sure each sport would say the same, they just happen to be the ones off the top of my head.
I suppose what I'm interested in particularly is that we know where it's going. I mean, from a health inequalities point of view, government as well as from the involvement of the justice services within government who are involved in this, surely we would want to know that we're not removing money from our more vulnerable and deprived communities and spending it in other places. I mean, I suppose my concern follows from concern on community sports hubs that money follows demand. And so if there's an application that comes from somewhere, then we want to spend the money we've got. These are the applications that we have, so we'll spend it in this way. You know, can government or anyone else show us, you know, a map of postcodes of where money is raised and where it is then spent through an initiative like cashback, in terms of cashback for sport?
I think each governing body, through their monitoring, is able to demonstrate where the different activities are gathered. So they have the lists of the people that participated, where they come from. It's part of the standard monitoring that the Scottish Government have undertaken. I think the three key challenges, I suppose, for the activities that are already organised is around a sustained element of funding. And part of that challenge, sometimes these things take quite a lot of time. I know the investment in some of the more recent sports has been a challenge in terms of pulling those partners together. Some of them are slightly smaller governing bodies, and it's been a challenge in terms of who are the right people to work with in each set of communities to try and make that happen. But those boundaries have been overcome, and there have been a huge amount of successes. But obviously it's a rolling sort of 3-year contract, and that takes time to establish things. So I know there have been some challenges with that. I think the key question probably from our members is around the strategic planning of where do we, you know, we've talked a lot today about finding those case studies and those examples of best practice and how we roll those out. So I guess the repeated question we've asked on behalf of our members is what is the strategic planning process around how we identify which sports, which activities, which programmes work best and how we work with that. So that's something that I'm sure Sport Scotland would echo as well, and I know our members would be, you know, pleased to be involved in any of that process. But how do, as you say, we make best use of what is a limited resource, but I think has already shown that it can provide benefits in local communities, and particularly against the preventative spend agenda. But the key part is making sure that that fits in with existing clubs, that we're getting them involved in the club structure, and that helps around that infrastructure and that sustainability.
Is there consultation and opportunity for you to have wider discussions on, you know, where lottery funding is going, where cashback is going? Did the government consult, for instance, you know, it was controversial one is the Communities Cup sponsorship. Were you consulted in that, and did you think that was good use of money, and how will that promote and support clubs and volunteers and activity? And yes, Stuart?
Resources into sport are welcome. What we would like to see, though, is a very clear strategic approach, which I think we do have nationally, and that reflected locally. In terms of the Communities Cup, there was absolute consultation. I think there is, given our experience with Stennismuir, I think there's a real opportunity with certain, probably the smaller, but not excluding the bigger clubs, but certainly the smaller football clubs to be a bit of a leader in the community. So we do think there is real merit in taking that forward. We could certainly provide on the facilities side with less. The government does its own monitoring around the revenue side of cashback, but the facility side, we have a strong role in that. We could let you know where the projects are and which locations, both football, rugby and others. We could certainly let you have all of that without any problem.
Yeah. So you discuss with government not just the ambition to have as much activity across Scotland, but you take into account need as well, because I think that's where Drew was focusing on some of our earlier questions, that all of the evidence that we've had shows that deprived communities have got less activity, they've got less volunteers, they've got less facilities, because articulate people who run the tennis clubs can get the money in rather than somebody who can't, whatever, you know. So I think the committee is very interested about what sort of what funding streams are available, where it's going and what it's supporting, and to be assured that there's some element here of looking at need and unmet needs, and you know, targeting priorities that need to be targeted.
Yeah, I mean, I can reassure you on that. We could give you a full list of where all our resources go, but there's one in particular I think that's been quite, I think, a big one for us, is that we are now beginning to offer Up to 100% grants for small community facilities. Now, I think that's got real potential. Sometimes identifying, convener, you're right, identifying the right projects with the right group is important, and we rely on our local contacts to do that. But I think we've got some real ambition to spread those resources into smaller communities, into deprived communities, to enhance small community facilities. Up to 100%. Now, there's other things we're doing. We can give you a full list, if that would be helpful.
We need to discuss as a committee, you know, in terms of who would have the information that we want, but we accept your kind offer, and we may return to that. Thanks. Lee Cousins was...
I think just one small comment. As Kim said, 90% of the resources going into sport go through local authorities. So the identification of resources to need is and should be happening at that level. That's where the majority of it happens, and it's so. If you're in a system where you know you have a contract with your local authorities and they're delivering on outcomes, then that's where you are. The ability to nationally direct that is quite hard when you've already devolved that decision making down to local authorities who have 90% of the resources that go to sport.
Yeah. This is our first session, and we have local government, colleagues patiently waiting, for our conclusion. Jim Eadie.
Thank you, Convener. I'd like to stay with the subject of community sports hubs, if I may, not least of all because I have in my own constituency a very good exemplar of good practice, if you like, in the Inch Park Community Sports Club. And I think, Mr Harris, you were at the opening of that facility, where we have rugby, football and cricket all under one roof, but most importantly working in collaboration with the local community through the Active Schools programme to grow participation in sport in the way that you've outlined this morning. What I'd really be interested in knowing, given the ambition that has been set by you of having every secondary school in Scotland as a community sports hub, what you see as being the barriers at the moment which prevent schools from coming up to that standard, and what we need to do in order to achieve that ambition.
I think the study, Jim, that we mentioned will give us a bit more insight into that. I mentioned before there are some contractual issues that I think are challenging. There are maybe some demand issues that we need, maybe got demand in the wrong place from the school. So I think there's a range of different factors. We'd prefer to try and get that evidence, that discussion about with each authority about what is open, what is available, and how can we then take that to another level. If there are difficult discussions with PPP contractors, then let us get involved in those discussions as well, so we actually truly bring that national and local, and actually it might be easier for us to have a bit of a stronger discussion in terms of the health of the nation and the ambition of the nation with some of the contractors than maybe the local authority would be. So we're up for that, absolutely. There is no doubt that we probably need to look at some innovative models as well around how the schools are managed. There are many good examples of keyholder status, of a much more flexible use of schools. Security is obviously an issue, and this has to be managed responsibly. But if communities are to be sustainable, and if they are to have pride in their own future, then I think we have to give them a bit more responsibility in how they help to manage, lead, direct, and operate some of the facilities. Not all of them by any manner of means, don't get me wrong. There are lots of facilities that need to be managed professionally, but I think there's an opportunity for a collaborative effort between communities and professionals to make that happen. Inch Park's a good example of that, and they're already looking at how they might have an impact on schools around that community as well.
That's helpful.
We're actually having our annual general meeting at Inch Park. We're actually having our annual general meeting at Inch Park, so we're looking forward to a visit there and getting all the governing bodies down there just in a few weeks' time, actually. But I think there are a few key priorities around, as you say, accessing facilities in opening up the school estate and those examples that you mentioned. And I think the sort of community hub idea that Stuart mentioned is around, I think there are a range of different kinds of activities, so sport, culture, the arts, heritage, who provide that same sort of community service, for want of a better phrase, who have that social impact about actually people within communities actively participating in something. And I think the community hub idea provides a real opportunity for better use of existing resources and bringing people together in a very different kind of way. So I think there's something really interesting about that. But I think some of the key principles that go around that are, as we've already said, the better use of existing facilities, but the accessibility being about evenings, weekends and holidays. And again, I know that's something that Sport Scotland are taking into account in the review that they're doing, but you hear examples of saying, oh, we're open at this time, but they're not open at that time. So, you know, I think there are some key principles in there. That there is priority access within those areas for community clubs. Obviously, we're going to say sport, but community clubs in its widest endeavour. And picking up on one of the points Lee made earlier about the home for clubs, that's a big challenge for a lot of clubs, as Lee was saying, around planning and saying, well, we have our lease until the end of X. Do we have it for the second term if it's within a school, or do we have it beyond X time within a local authority? If they don't own their own club, how do they do that planning beyond the current year? So length of lease and length of those kinds of arrangements are a priority, along with the provision of a social area. A lot of the clubs in Inch Park have it as well. A lot of clubs that have a social area provide that kind of heart in a local community where people can go along. It provides the additional social connectedness, the intergenerational links, a lot of the things that I know we've spoken about. But again, a lot of sports clubs don't have that access. So I think that's an important opportunity to, you know, sort of further emphasise some of the benefits of sports clubs and clubs if they have that access. And accessibility remains a challenge, and certainly I know you've got our colleagues from Scottish Disability Sport in future, and I know Gavin will emphasise that, but inclusion access from that point of view and making sure that facilities have that opportunity is again a key priority within that. So I think there's a lot of really good work, but I think there are a few key principles which underpin some of those opportunities within existing facilities.
That's helpful. I'm mindful of the offer that Mr Harris has made of having some of the more robust discussions and conversations that may need to happen around opening up the school estate. So I'm sure we'll be in touch with you about that.
Yeah. And, you know, I mean, I guess it's probably important to say that whilst we really value the relationship we have with all 32 authorities, a lot of the decisions are made locally about schools. So we will certainly play our part, but we need our local authority colleagues to be absolutely right there. There's a huge amount of fixed cost already in schools in terms of the facility, the fabric, and also the human resource. So it shouldn't be beyond us to come up with solutions that are quite cost effective to do that. But we're doing it in a collaborative way, and we're not kicking people down the street.
So the barrier to achieving the ambition of having every school as a community sports hub may not be primarily a financial one?
I don't think it's just a financial one. I don't think so. I think I love to be ambitious, and I think in a few years' time, hopefully we'll have the same conversation, and we'll have 350 community sports hubs in Scotland.
I think some of it is cultural. I mean, across the range of types of management of schools, you'll see examples of very good sports provision and open to the community in all sorts of institutional settings. And what it generally comes down to is, as Stuart said, it's about the leadership. It's about whether the head teacher wants it or not. And that individual and that culture, I think it's actually more important than the institutional framework within that school and even within local authority to local authority, where you would expect a consistent education policy. I suggest to you that you'll see quite vast differences, and it's about down to the culture of the head teacher and the senior management team. And it's getting that culture of valuing sport and what it contributes to the community into that overall culture of education at the senior management team level.
Can I just ask finally for completeness what the view of the panel is in terms of the role that primary schools can play, particularly given the emphasis that there is in policy terms on early years and the comments made earlier by Anne Kerr about the need to encourage participation amongst very young children at as early a stage as possible?
Anne?
I would say that high quality physical education in primary schools is critical in this extent. It builds on what children learn through active play, and it's about taking active play through into active recreation, active sport, dance, and building on that through the primary school, and having our primary school teachers having that culture of valuing physical activity in all its forms.
Yeah. I mean, primary schools are are key in on offering young people a range of different opportunities in different sports and activities at those early learning years, so that they're better equipped going forwards. The commitment to physical education, the commitment to after school and community activity, primary and secondary school level, those are key.
Atkinson?
I think I don't think primary schools are the only people with responsibility, but I guess fundamentally they're the one place where every child should be, and hopefully every child is. So if they aren't accessing opportunities within family or other life, primary school is the one place that can capture everybody. Therefore, I think they do have a huge responsibility. I think the three parts, as I mentioned before, they provide the opportunity is that quality P, the opportunity for every young person to be physically literate, run, jump, throw, catch and swim. If you have that, great. It is the culture of being regularly physically active, which is where the interest in the 2 hours from our members came from. And don't get me wrong, I suppose 2 hours is the minimum, and ideally we'd be looking for more than that. And I know the Active Schools work and work of other clubs builds on that. But at the end of the day, if being regularly active is a cultural norm for people at that age, that's a great start. And that it's fun and they develop that confidence, so that in later life, if they decide they want to take part in sport A or activity B, they have the skills and the confidence and they think it's going to be fun to take part. If we can get those three things in primary schools, I think they would be the priorities.
Can I just add to that? If you were to ask the leader of the governing bodies what is important to them, before actually teaching their own sport, they would say, we would like to have children that are physically literate at the end of primary school. And then whatever sport we want to go into, we can develop. They prioritise that above turning someone into a rugby player or a swimmer or anything else, just the ability to be physically literate.
Yes, John Howie.
And just one final comment around primary schools is how children get to the primary school and return home, and the continued emphasis on active travel to school and ensuring we've got safe streets for children to walk. And also, we've touched on already around flexible working practices that allow parents and carers to support their children, develop good walking habits to their place of education that should follow with them into secondary schooling.
I think that concludes it. I think we've got a quick...
Sorry, I thought one of...
Oh, sorry. Does somebody else want to... Sorry, Mary Allison.
Just really to reassure you as well around some of the data and the intelligence that we're providing back to those networks of active school coordinators in a primary school, in a secondary school and in the hub, because the data that we are supporting them to gather nationally and we're holding for them nationally and giving them back in a simple format that I explained earlier, part of the reason for doing that is to allow that primary, secondary school in the hub to better coordinate and choose their activities so that we minimise the chances of primary schools doing one activity, secondary schools doing another, the hub operates. That's a worse scenario, and that's not what we want. We want that community to really build on the strengths and assets it's got. So if they have good volunteer coaches in a particular sport, let's make sure the primary school, the secondary school and the hub are all benefiting from that. So that's part of our role, I think, nationally, is to help them to plan better locally, to focus on the strengths they've got and to make sure they're using those strengths in every bit of their community space that they can.
I think Bob Doris is just going to lead on to some of those community assets.
Well, actually,
nope.
It wasn't that I was going to follow up on, but I will be incredibly brief with what I did want to do. It's actually on Drew Smith's point. We were looking for some more information in terms of the community sports hubs. I'd be keen to make sure that we're comparing apples with apples when we look at the investment in communities, because you would look at that and you would go, oh, Glasgow got 3, Inverclyde got 3. How does that come out? The sausage machine decides these things. So it'd be quite good. My understanding is community sports hubs are funded by £1.5 million per annum up to 2015-16. So it'd be quite good to get what the investment is per local authority on that, because obviously some remote rural areas may have relatively small community sports hubs with a small public sector investment, just so we can get that kind of commensurate. I'm also kind of quite keen to find out what the strategy is for post, if you like, 2014-15, because I was looking at the budget here and I can see that in the next 3 years there'll be £300 million of Scottish taxpayers' money specifically for the Commonwealth Games. That's the Chris Hoy Velodrome, the National Indoor Sports Arena, Tollcross Pool, etc., etc. I mean, almost sports hubs in all but name. Fantastic facilities we've got, but it's how we're going to use them productively after the Commonwealth Games. And I think the final thing I wanted just to put on record, Convener, was we mentioned cash back for communities. My understanding is that that is distributed by YouthLink Scotland, and the basis for it is 80% population, 20% remote and rural, and 20% based in deprivation. I'm just wondering if Mr Howe or maybe Ms Caird believes that health inequalities may be a useful indicator in future for when you decide how that money is spent going forward. It'd be quite useful to know that. And one final thing, indulging myself, we really should put on the record is we talked about a lack of coordination, or a concern there may be a lack of coordination, and you've sought particularly Mr Harris to reassure us on that. But my understanding is the statutory obligation to provide that coordination is on community planning partnerships at a local level based in 2007 legislation. Sorry to fit all that in, but time is short and I want to put as much on the record as possible. Mr Howe, I don't know if you've got a view on the divvying up of cash back for communities.
Well, it's fantastic to be given the authority, even just for a few seconds. But I think it goes back to criteria for funding allocations based on need. There's sufficient evidence to suggest that there's certain populations that will benefit from additional investment. It certainly was the case in terms of a programme that I was recently involved in around Keepwell, where it was dedicated resources into our most 20% deprived communities to engage in primary prevention through primary care. So I think the same rules apply to other funding allocations. There's considerable merit in that, because whilst there will be local decisions being made in terms of allocations, there'll be other drivers that will determine what local organisations get that funding. I think there's always a place for a national role to say this is the criteria based on need where money should be going for specific populations.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for your indulgence.
Do you want to come back there? Yeah,
I mean, just to again reassure Bob that this isn't a short-term strategy we have for sport and recreation in Scotland. This is something that goes way beyond the Commonwealth Games. It's putting a system in place for both performance and community sport. Then we'll be able to achieve the ambitions that I think we all of you around the table and ourselves actually are striving for. It's not really about a cliff edge at 2014. So we certainly will want to continue all of the good work we're doing and actually for Scotland to be ambitious.
Before I ask you, before you leave, what you would expect out of this inquiry, if I'll give you some notice of that. I mean, I think from Vocal, which is the leisure and local authority basis, that they agree with what we've heard this morning in terms of access to children's play areas, maximising access to school estate. But there is an issue in terms of the longer term, and the issue about ensuring that the resources that we have now and have been currently developed through PPP and other initiatives in the Commonwealth, etc., is about and they refer particularly to the ticking time bomb reports in regards to swimming, particularly to swimming, but obviously, with this changing nature of ownership, arm's length, organisations, reducing pots of money, is this an issue you would share concern with in terms of how we maintain those community assets going into the future, and how do you believe that we can and should do that?
I mean, there's no doubt the facility stock will take a lot of commitment to maintain and to further develop. But again, just the discussions we're having with local government, there is still a huge commitment there, Convener, to do that. However, there are financial pressures, and we have to look and respect what local authorities do around making decisions on priorities. But we certainly stand ready as a national agency to look at any way in which we can help make the facility stock more effective, whether it's been influencing or funding. So I think those conversations will go on.
Lee Cousins.
I just think there's one important thing about the facilities. The quality of the facilities has a direct impact on participation. And a poor quality facility will turn off participation without a doubt at the root. So there is a job to be done here in balancing investment in more facilities and the maintenance of the quality of existing facilities. So in an era of restricted resources, I think we have to look hard at whether we've got that balance right between holding up the quality of our existing facilities as opposed to adding new ones.
Okay. Yes, Mary Alice.
Small comment on that. I mean, one of the biggest studies that's been done on effective community sport intervention really showed that one of the critical factors is that communities use every bit of their community's estate. So notwithstanding the pressures and the challenges on local authorities' sports facilities, which we need to and we will engage in seeing how we can deal with some of that, there are actually potentially in communities a lot of resource that is perhaps underused or underutilised. And we ourselves as well, looking at the whole outdoor and adventure sport agenda. I mean, Scotland has one of the most fantastic set of ready-made natural resources for sport. And we think there's a lot more value in that for us in terms of being able to drive up participation through some of those channels. So I guess it's also about recognising some of the financial realities and bringing imagination, creativity and to reusing and to expanding the use of facilities that have perhaps not been in our sites in the past.
I think that concludes our questions as a committee, and but I do give you that opportunity, if you wish to take it, to that if there are areas where that haven't been covered that you feel that are important to mention, put on the record here, or that particular emphasis you would wish the committee to look at, then feel free to do so. If you don't feel like doing that now, you can always communicate with the committee after this session and reflection. We'd welcome that as well.
I'd just like to make one point. I think all our experience in developing sport is it comes down to the individual. It comes down to that committed individual. That individual has got to be in his bonnet about wanting to achieve something. Those individuals that get together and have an interaction that gets some communal energy. And that's, in the end, if you look at all the quality examples, and even places like Inch Park, which was driven by a couple of individuals, it's when those individuals actually get to work and get some interaction with each other that the energy comes and the growth in participation comes. And I think that is particular in some of the deprived areas and some of the less sporty areas that we might think. So, although it's, I just would like the committee to understand that lining up national strategies is one thing, but making sure that local people, when they get that energy, when they get that concept, when they get that idea, have the ability to find probably some information and some assistance and some channels of working, as much as getting hold of resources. It's quite important. I do think that the driver for community sport is from the bottom up and not necessarily from the top down.
Kim Atkinson.
I think I know we spoke a little bit around budget just there, just to obviously the budget for sport is only set till 2014-2015. Conscious also the UK government have made an extension beyond that for 2016 to Rio for performance sports. So again, the strategies that we were talking about earlier about short-term planning are certainly also true. So I'm sure there's an opportunity there, particularly obviously thinking of the legacy from the games. In terms of opportunities, I think fundamentally we can't lose sight of the fact that sport is fun, whether you're participating in it or volunteering in it. Fun is the heart of it all. So I know we talk about funding and we talk about strategies and we talk about everything else, but it is fun and it must remain the heart of that. I think part of the opportunity through the inquiry is about recognising, promoting and hopefully more people understanding the value of sport to communities and the value that clubs place and that additional value they place in communities. Whether it's about enjoyment, whether it's about participation, whether it's about preventative spend, the additional value that sport and sports clubs provide within communities. I think there are opportunities for increased partnership working and some of the sharing of best practice that we've mentioned, and I think that's a great opportunity as an outcome for that. And I think the third part is looking at a legacy beyond where we already are. And by legacy, I selfishly do mean a legacy for sport. I appreciate there'll be a lot of legacies from the 2014 Commonwealth Games. Particularly our members are interested that there is a legacy for sport as well as all the other kinds of legacies. We've spoken about physically literate children. We've spoken about employer-supported volunteering. But I think some of those opportunities for partnerships between health and how we really make those, we've already heard some great examples. And I know when you call in the Minister, the Chief Medical Officer and Dr Andrew Murray, again, they'll have different different examples, but I think there's a new opportunity there to bring what I know we've talked already about people who perhaps are excluded in one way or another or have poorer health, and I think there are more opportunities within that, so I'm sure there'll be an exciting opportunity coming out there.
Okay. No one else? Sure.
Comment, Convener, I've certainly appreciated the balance of the discussion that you've had as a committee about the strategic approach and commitment, and also specific interventions and programmes. And I think that's something to be welcomed, because often the strategic approach is forgotten. So it would be really, if that continues, then thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for your time and participation and the evidence provided this morning. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. We're going to suspend at this point and get round the table. Move to our second evidence session with panel 2, and can I warmly welcome Stuart Uni, Service Manager, Sport and Active Recreation Perth, and Kinross Council, and a member of the National Executive Committee of Vocal. Andrew Bain, Chief Executive of Active Stirling and Chairman of Sporta Scotland, and Oliver Barsby, Chief Operating Officer, Scottish Association of Local Sports Councils, Stephen Percy, Community Sport Hub Development Officer, East Renfrewshire Council, and Willie Young, Community and Sport Lead Manager, Argyll and Bute Council, and Darryl McKenzie, Community Sport Hubs Officer, Leisure and Culture, Dundee. Thank you all for your attendance this morning. We're running half an hour behind, which is not unusual. Predictable, says Richard. You know, in this session, we hope that we can have some discussion between you rather than the formal questions that will be put to you. But we should, you know, sort of kick it off in terms of, I mean, you know, I think there's been a lot said this morning in terms of where the money lies, and 90% of the responsibility of all of this is, and the statutory obligation of this is, and community planning all comes down to that local activity. Do we all agree? Willie Young shaking his head, so you're first up, Willie.
Thanks. Fell for that one. I think the myth of 90% of expenditure on sport in going to local authorities should be dispelled. The vast majority of that money pays for facilities, it pays for staff who run these facilities, and it pays for the infrastructure. In terms of the development side of things, which is where we're coming from, we're the food relations basically. There's no statutory obligation within local authorities to provide for sports development other than an adequate level, which is wording which comes from the, what is it, I should know that one off the top of my head. Anyway, it comes from an act from way back, and the interpretation of it is obviously varies across the country.
Do we all agree, or does anyone wish to add to that? Please.
I mean, I think Willie's comments are relevant, that a large proportion of spend does go on direct facility management, complex buildings like ice rinks, swimming pools, etc. Cost a lot of money to run. Health and safety means we have to have a lot of staff to run them. However, hopefully that's money well spent in further developing sport, because it gives a safe, friendly and positive environment for clubs, recreational activity and young people to come and enjoy physical activity, and hopefully embed that into a lifetime of keeping active and health and well-being from that. But I think, as Willie says, there is, I think on paper there will be 90% of the resource goes into local provision. We would dearly like to see, and I know the members of Sporta, who are leisure trusts who run facilities and contract services for sports development and active school on behalf of local authorities, would love to see the ability to do more direct spend into community sport initiatives, sports development programmes, etc., to embed that lifelong learning.
Stuart, Uni.
Maybe just sort of sit somewhere in the middle, and from my two colleagues, and I think they're both absolutely right. From a vocal perspective, I think the real question is how we're spending that 90% going forward, particularly entering into some very difficult financial times ahead. And if we're looking particularly, as this inquiry is, and support for community support, it's how we use that investment to support community support, and whether that's through the provision of facilities and hard assets and access to them, or whether it's the support that's needed. And I welcomed the discussion earlier on about how we're going in to support volunteers, volunteer organisations, and help build capacity within communities. So I think there are two very distinct issues there in terms of the spend and the responsibilities that local authorities have, and it's useful, I think, to take that perspective going forward into the discussions.
Your submission, takes it. We're all well aware of the arm's length organisations running it for the local authorities, but your submission from Vocal looks at increasing, or supports the trend of looking at community self-management options. For example, leasing facilities too. So we would get, further and further away. Would that raise concerns in terms of a leasing arrangement by sports club? Would that raise concerns with the local authority and its assets? Willie Young.
Argyll and Bute have a community involvement in the management of our facilities. We have one facility in Oban, which I believe you're meeting with tonight, Atlantis Leisure, which has been a community enterprise, or what would now be termed a social enterprise, since 1991. And it's a very successful partnership. I mean, they lease the building from the council, or they have done since 1981, and we pay them a subsidy. It's a bit of an arm's length, but it's not the arm's length model you see across Scotland, where it's still the control is within the local authority, whether it be as members sitting on boards or whatever. This is a completely community-run facility. With some council money put in. We have another 2 facilities, community facilities within Argyll and Bute, which are smaller, and they're completely community-run, community-led, community-built, and we give a grant towards their operation. Now, these are 3 very successful examples of community involvement, community drive to get their own facilities, whereas the council wouldn't otherwise have provided these.
What are the benefits that Darryl, please? Well,
just to touch on what Willie was saying there, we're probably in a similar point of view in Dundee, although we're probably 20 years behind what Atlantis Leisure are doing. And we've got 3 very specific community sport hubs who have utilised a council-run building, changing rooms facility, meeting room for the best part of the last 20-25 years. Now, for that time, they've been constantly putting that money in, whether it just be weekly income or monthly subscriptions into the council, and the facilities have been continuing to get worse and worse, just with general wear and tear and maintenance, which the council haven't uplifted to a specific standard, or certainly a standard which the young people and the youths of today are expecting of these facilities. Now, the community sport hubs that I'm working with, they're just entering in discussions with the local authority to look at a similar kind of agenda as what Atlantis Leisure are, whereas they take on long-term lease or ownership over these facilities, and every pound which is then put back into the facility from the community goes towards bettering the facility. And to me, that's a model which I think is one which we should be pushing. And the whole talk on social enterprise is one which we are taking a great interest in Dundee, and really looking to try and roll that model out amongst sports clubs, because the people who I talk to from Sense Scotland and Scottish Government and Sports Scotland are saying that the majority of sports clubs in Scotland are community enterprises, or they are social enterprises as such, because they're taking money and providing a service of football, rugby, basketball training, and they're putting that money back into sport, whichever way their community is telling them to do it, whether that be through a fundraiser, whether it be through an annual trip to a competition or a festival, whether that be through new sports kit, whatever that is, their community is telling them what they want spent their money on, and that's then going back in. So I think the model that Atlantis Leisure are doing is one to be favoured upon, and it's certainly one which we're looking to try and roll out in Dundee.
Yes. Andrew.
You may not be surprised I want to come in there. The model that Willie referred to, I think the traditional model that Sporta members are, that social enterprise, and indeed many of our members have social enterprise mark status. We are all independent of the local authorities and have specific management contracts. There will be representation from the local authority on the board to represent the investment that a local authority makes, but the companies run as independent organisations with volunteer boards. To give you an example, use my own organisation, we have a board of 13 directors. 5 of the 13 directors are council appointments, the rest are drawn from local business community and sports people, including Club Sports Stirling, which is our local sports association. It's the board that decides the policy based on the contract arrangements with the local authority. So in terms of moving more to that model, I think there's ground to be made, because the local authorities can still dictate the strategic priorities. So picking up on Stuart Harris's evidence, if the strategic framework is correct nationally and there's a clear ask for local authorities to deliver, that can then be passed down through the contract documents for any type of social enterprise, whether it's an individual club, a community environment like Atlantis Leisure, or a more formal cultural and leisure trust like Glasgow Life or South Lanarkshire Leisure. That's where the protection should come, through proper contract documentation and partnership working to deliver the shared objectives and be a key member of the community planning partnership. And then it starts to tie in all the strategic areas, but hopefully give a cost-efficient benefit of the delivery of sport physical activity.
Stuart?
Just to come in, Convener, I completely agree with Andy, and I think that the point you were perhaps alluding to is a potential tension between leasing out facilities to, correct me if I'm wrong, to community organisations, maybe perhaps those that have traditionally been run by a local authority, and that's certainly becoming something that the local authorities are starting to look more seriously at. I think we have a very mixed economy of provision in terms of our asset management. Some of them have been owned and managed by local clubs for many hundreds of years in some cases. Some were now new facilities that are looking to come on stream that are owned and managed by local authorities and managed by leisure trusts as well. So we have a very mixed picture, and now with the development of community sports clubs looking towards increasing the use of school estates in particular. So I think all of the there's lots of great examples about arrangements that have been put in place that are meeting the needs, or better meeting the needs of local communities. And I think that needs to be driven locally by a strategic approach. So where perhaps it's not the role of the local authority to own and operate and manage, it's perhaps a better position for the local trust to be in. Equally, it may well be for local community organisations and local clubs to take on that role. And I think what we need to do is look at that mixed economy, take a very strategic approach to what communities need, what is it for the best interests of those communities, whether it's clubs or whether it's a more semi-commercial approach to sport and leisure provision, and look at that right mix and that right balance of facility across our school estate, whether it's club owned and run, whether it's part of a school estate, or whether it's an independent leisure facility.
Yes?
I would agree local authorities are looking to, for want of a better word, offload these community facilities to social enterprises or local voluntary community clubs due to budget constraints. As well as that, we often do find that there are some very good examples of community clubs or social enterprises that do that already. But again, it comes back to the people, and there has to be a due process, potentially a planning group that says, you know, which facilities are best for certain groups or for certain clubs. And to do that, I think it has to be a form of investment as well. You know, a lot of the facilities we're talking about are often pavilions or, you know, just community halls, often to give a club a social base. But often for some of the clubs in the area, what they really need is access to a higher quality of facility, which are currently still owned by the local authorities. You know, potentially games halls or 3G football pitches, or, you know, potentially substantial assets.
Oliver?
Thank you. I think through some of the work I've done, some of the issues that get raised is not necessarily cost, but it's more so the access to the facilities and where they can go to find that information out. I think sometimes when facilities move away from the local authority, there becomes an extreme variance in price, and where do you go to access and see what's available. I think sometimes there needs to be greater consistency in terms of where do you go to find out what pictures are available. Do you go through the school estate? Do you go through the leisure trust? Do you go through the local authority? And it's just really some way of compiling all that information together and having a consistency in terms of the cost as well. Because if you go through leisure trust, it might be one price. If you go through the council, they might charge a different price for a pitch. So it's just ensuring that that information is clear. Because sometimes the barrier isn't necessarily that the facilities aren't there, but it's the community don't know where to go to find that information out, and it's not very clear.
Richard, did you want to come in on this?
I think the point I made earlier, and most of you were sitting during it, you know, we've got sports councils, local authorities, Sports Scotland, all the different authorities. How can we best do it locally? And over the years, in a previous life, yes, councils offloaded to trusts, whatever. Some worked, some didn't work. Some actually increased the membership and costs. The concern that local people have is when you're taking all these facilities out of what they believe is their control. So I know it's worked well in places like Perth, Dundee, and I have to say North Lanarkshire. It's what, but again, I'll come back on to what is your view in the development of community sports hubs, and what would be the opportunities in order to pull all the existing authorities together in order to promote sport in Scotland?
Darryl, yes.
Obviously, the fact that I applied for the job and I'm now sitting here means that I'm a firm believer in the benefits of community sport hubs. And I think, having been in the job for the last 14, 15 months now, I've seen some real key case studies and some projects of how it can work. And I do agree 100% with what you're saying, that by us giving official status, or an asset to a group of body, a charity or a ski, or whoever that ends up being, a community sports club, some people within the public may see that as actually taking that away from the local authority, i.e. the public body having the opportunity to support that. And I think what's key for me, and it's a piece of work which we've tried to do heavily in our community sport hubs as Dundee, is to really go out and engage with the community. And it's about making sure that we are getting the leaders of the community within that board, so that it is open to all, and there shouldn't be the stigma around, once this community sports club takes ownership over a pavilion, a piece of land, a training pitch, whatever, that it's then ring fenced for that club. It has to be open to, it is open to the wider community, and that's where that partnership working between the NHS, between schools, between local authority, between sports development, between all of the people who are involved in the sports sector, they have to have that understanding that just because it's now a Dundee East Community Sports Club who own the facility rather than Dundee City Council, that it is still open to all, and it's available and it's accessible, and that by them taking part within that facility, they're actually putting back into their community. And I think that's the real key stumbling block for me, is it's identifying the leaders and it's making sure that that message is out there to the community. Like I said, I've been in the job for 14, 15 months now, and I still sometimes meet people within the sports sector who will say to me, what is a community sports hub? And I think that's a job which we have to take on locally and nationally to make sure that people are aware of this message and what we are trying to change.
Could I come in at that?
Yes.
I listened to that, and it's really interesting. Could you tell us what the impact in your experience is of what's happening on the ground? What's the difference now as against before we had the hubs?
Well, I was involved very, very briefly with community sports clubs, voluntary sports clubs, through my job at Sports Development before I took on the role of the Community Sport Hub Officer. And just to paint you a picture, we've got a small community called Broughty Ferry in Dundee, on the east side of Dundee, which had probably the best part of 13, 14 clubs, good voluntary sports clubs who we were working with through our Club Dundee programme to develop and to nurture and to come up with ambitions and dreams and visions and aims of where they wanted to go. Now, with the role of Community Sports Hub, what we've actually managed to do is to set up something similar to this, where we have 14 or 15 of these clubs round the table, and they're actually discussing general issues, whether it be partnerships with local authority, whether it be what and where they would like the facilities to be, whether it be access to schools, whether it be access to external funding. And what we actually have now is we have a bit of a round table approach set up where these guys are meeting regularly. There's no commitment, there's no contract that they sign to say they will put into this for a certain part of time, but as long as that's fitting the needs and it's benefiting each individual sports club, then they continue to attend the meetings and they continue to discuss local needs and how they can better do that. And it's very difficult within a sports club, anybody who's involved in one, to find 5 or 6 people who have that dream and who have that vision to work together. And what you tend to find with each individual sports club is you'll have 1 or 2 people who basically run the club and who will deal with the coaching, the parents, the facilities, the equipment, the vision, the long term, the budget. And I think what the Community Sport Hubs gives us an opportunity to do is to put 6 or 7 of these people who are dealing with 6 or 7 clubs in the same room, and actually to say, you're dealing with the same schools, the same partners, the same local MPs, the same sports development section, the same facilities. You're competing against the same local facility there. Can we work together to really solve these generic issues, which may be different in each community, but they are the same in the nuts and bolts of what we're trying to do?
I can get a picture of the organisation. What I would like to hear, Darryl, if you could explain, if I use this language, how does it impact on the punters, the users of the service, the people? Has that improved, or is it the same?
Yeah, well, again, just to paint another picture of the community sports club in question, Dundee East, they started off as a 5-strong football community sports club. They were purely football based. Within the last year, we've managed to add another local sports club that deals with rugby, cricket, table tennis, tennis and badminton. And now we've just added the handball club and also a local Tenchinkin karate club. Now, 2 or 3 years ago, the focus was very much on football for that community sports club. And what you had 5 individual sports clubs, one of which was a junior football club, one of which was an amateur dealing with the adult side of the game, and then 3 of which were SFA quality mark youth accreditation clubs. So large pathways through. Now, 5 years ago, each of the clubs, although they were based in the east side of the city, were travelling to and for all over Dundee to take part in decent facilities. So some of which were going to the west side of the city to book a hall from 6 to 8 on a Monday night. Others were going to the east side. Some were going to the central belt. And they were quite scattered around. Now that's quite difficult to promote that sense of community ownership. By them coming together as a football club initially, they created a bit of a vision, a bit of a facility strategy that they wanted to go out and gain external funding to build their own training pitch which they could all utilise. About 3 or 4 months ago, we managed to get that up and off the ground, and within about 12 weeks, we now have a 60 by 40 outdoor 3G AstroTurf floodlit facility right in the heart of that Dundee East community. Now, although it's not singled out for the guys involved in that club, I think about 85% of the bookings are for each of the community clubs. So they general regular punters who were travelling all over Dundee to take part in a community club which is situated in the east of the city now have to travel a maximum of 2 or 3 miles to a facility which they can come on. They come on backwards and forwards, so you have an under-13s team playing at 6 to 7, an under-14s at 7 to 8, the under-15s at 8 to 9, so on and so forth. So it just helps with that pathway, and it helps to get that real sense of community ownership. And now what the club are looking at in their facility strategy is, okay, we've maybe not solved football for the next 15 years, but we've taken care of football a little bit. Now can we concentrate on the other strands of the club, and how do we increase their facilities so that we have a similar programme around the community club, if that makes sense?
Yeah, sure does.
Provoked a bit of interest. Oliver, Stephen and Willie want to come in the back of some of that. Oliver.
Thank you very much. I fully support what Darryl was saying. I mean, in terms of what my views are, is I think a lot of the earlier session focused on the importance of showing the facilities and the facility side of things. But I think in terms of the other benefit of community sports hubs are, as Darryl was just emphasising there, the local strategic importance of sharing resources in terms of bringing the volunteers together. If you have 6 or 7 key volunteers, it's helping them to share the jobs so that they can use their energy the most effective way possible. And in terms of connecting with other local groups like Active Schools, rather than having to make contact with 6 or 7 clubs separately, if they can use one central contact, the community sports hub, and it creates a much better joined up approach. And it's not the same for Active Schools; it's for schools, any community groups. So I think it's more than just the sharing of the facility that the key to the community sports hubs.
Stephen?
I also have a similar role to Darryl, and I think it's very important to stress the flexibility that community sports hubs can have. For East Renfrewshire, we have a very successful and well-established programme of community development centres, and these are council-run classes. The downside with these are that they are often delivered between the ages of 5 and 18, and you often get a drop-off before that, but you often find that it doesn't lead anywhere. It's good activity, it's skill development, but it doesn't link very well with anything. So I firmly believe that the better way to do that is to work with clubs, because they can link with the governing bodies, they can often link to competition. It's very flexible and also, how do I put it, performance orientated or ability orientated, to say that if you want to do a foundation level activity, you can do it within the community sport hub. If you are a particularly talented performer and you wish to go for a regional trial or a national trial, we link with the governing body, so therefore we can put you in touch with that or get information to do that. As well as that, the community sport hubs want to link with other community organisations, might be housing or health sectors, to create programmes that can tackle potential outcomes on health boards or housing associations, universities if you've got them available for volunteers, or to get people with expertise into your organisation. As well as that might be the police. We spoke a little bit about cashback, so it might be that the clubs, away from their normal bread and butter activities, can create diversion activity linking with community safety partnerships to try and reduce crime in the area. But as well as that, it's done by the community for the community, so instead of it being delivered by another agency or an arm's length agency, you find that there's more buy-in because you have that shared value.
For that, Willie?
Music to my ears. I heard earlier on community sports. Somebody said, how many community sports hubs are you building, or are you hoping, how many buildings are going to host community sports clubs? Community sports hubs are not about buildings, and that's, if they are, I'm in the wrong job, and I've been doing the wrong thing for the last year with community sports hubs. They're about people. They're about what we've just discussed. What Darryl was saying and everybody else has followed on from. That's exactly right. It's about how do we help people get more confident in what they're doing? Because a lot of these people are volunteers, and they're doing their own thing. They're probably 90 to 100% of their time is spent trying to put a team in the park on a Saturday afternoon, scrambling around for enough people, or getting someone to take the junior section on a Tuesday night because the dad that was taking that can't make it because he's working late, etc., etc. So it's all about people, and it's about instilling confidence in the people who are running these things, that they're not alone, that also there's people who, if they shared what they're doing with and they shared their ambitions together, they can achieve so much more. And I think we've allowed, and we're all guilty of it right across the board, from top to bottom in the country of sport, of allowing these people just to flounder and do their own thing without coordination. And one thing that the funding that community sports hubs does is allow us and local authorities to spend a bit more time and resource these people to help them realise what they can do together. And I think that's the important thing, realise what they can do together and achieve so much more.
Stuart.
Echo all of that. I think you obviously hear from Darryl and Stephen that the work that they do in their roles is absolutely critical. And I think what's the big benefit that the investment into community sports hubs will bring about is this kind of the bringing together of the people and the places agenda, a couple of the key themes that the committee was looking into. But it is bringing together people at a local level, local people and local organisations. And I think fundamental to that is that the support that we're able to offer, either through local authorities or through leisure trusts, to build capacity and to create those connections and those networks. And going back to the point that Richard was making, what is the benefit of community sports hubs? I think from a vocal perspective, we really see this as an opportunity to bring together some of those issues, to be far more responsive to communities in terms of the types of facilities that we're providing, the types of access arrangements that we have in place, and the types of support that we have for those organisations, which is critical. Because if these are going to work, they need strong organisations, they need strong people in behind them. And I think clubs, notoriously, I think it was Darryl that said, it's often maybe one or two key individuals, making sure that there's succession planning within that organisation, making sure that there's an infrastructure behind them as volunteers to support what they're doing, is absolutely fundamental to this. And having the people like Darryl and like Stephen, like others out there working in the sports development profession to support local clubs and organisations is absolutely critical to the success of community sports hubs and to developing clubs and local organisations.
It's helpful. Drew?
The point about hubs not being buildings, I understand that, and I think my issue was about whether or not we're equitable about how we are spending resource across the country. I'm not bothered whether a hub is the Chris Hoy Velodrome or whether it's a network of people being supported to do something. That's not my interest. But what I suppose I wanted to ask people here about is the, in terms of that numbers game and public money being spent and our objectives out of that, is it fair to ask you to be doing the work that you're doing around harder community sport, which is a lot of what people are talking about here, about actually involving, engaging, supporting and encouraging people who are involved explicitly in perhaps competitive sport or could be encouraged to become involved in it and can be supported to become better and all the advantages that brings, versus a separate issue around our level of physical activity that we have in the country, the harder to reach groups that are not perhaps going to become involved to the same extent in these hubs. Is it reasonable for us to say you've got to do both of those things, or is there value in them both separately? I'm conscious we've got a panel of people talking about sport in communities, convener, and we have an all-male panel. What does that tell us about? Does that tell us as a committee how we sort you out, or does that tell you something about the network that we're creating in communities? What's your impression of what you're being asked to do in terms of what you've been asked to measure and report back on the work that you're doing? Are people at the national level like us saying, and we want you to tell us about physical activity, and we want you to involve more people that, frankly, you're not going to be able to reach and get in the way that we're asking you to do it.
Andrew's making a bid for this.
From my perspective and my colleagues, I think, yes, it is reasonable to ask us to do both, but the key to projects like community sports hubs is that improved communication and partnership working, because we can't do it on our own. So a leisure trust won't successfully deliver the full pathway of sport and the full pathway of physical activity, but can be a key provider in certain elements of that. You know, we need the support of governing bodies, we need the support of local communities, local authorities, etc. And from my perspective, certainly, I think the Community Sports Hubs project has a real chance of improving that communication and avoiding duplication, where what happens is you end up with various partners in especially more rural, widely spread communities, doing the same things, when actually if we come together and share the resources, share the learning experiences, we'd have a much stronger end product and hopefully then be able to spread the benefits wider. Because I think we need to have this double strand pathway. You know, we focus a lot in sport about the performance pathway. How do we get the next Chris Hoy? How do we get the next gold medal winner, which is vitally important. But equally, how do we get just the next, my daughter's 8 just now, so how do I ensure my daughter who's 8 just now, when she's 18, will still think actually going to the pool or going to the gym or taking my bike instead of jumping on the car or the bus is important to her from a health point of view. And then it's the interlinks there, because I think sometimes we're oversubscriptive about when you can hit a performance pathway and when you're on a physical activity pathway. And I think the reality is we all mature and reach our peaks at different times and get interested at different times. So it's trying to have that partnership approach where you can jump from one side to the other, because one of the biggest motivators we've seen, certainly, you look at, we've just had a fantastic Olympic Games, there's fantastic Paralympic Games on just now, and people are starting to say, well, how do these guys train? And I think it was Andy Murray tweeted something about his 400-metre split time compared to Mo Farah's. And then all of a sudden, online community, that's created a whole interest about, oh, what can I do my 400-metre time and how can I emulate that sports star? And it's not about somebody going to be a gold medal tennis player or a gold medal 10,000-metre athlete, but that motivation that performance sport can give for physical activity, I think, is vital to capture.
Willie, Darrell, and then I think Stuart.
I think it's important to recognise that one of the, as the way I see it, one of the reasons that community sports hubs have come around is because there's been a realisation that there's a gap. There's a massive big gap here in the middle. Performance sport is done. It's sorted. They might argue otherwise. Active schools do a great job in that transition from school into community sport, but there's a big gap in the middle. Where's the support for community clubs? Where's the support for people who are not actively engaged in competition? Within a rural area like Argyll and Bute, competition is really quite difficult because, first of all, it's difficult to find somebody to play against. And if you do find somebody to play against, you tend to have to travel quite a wee bit, either to play area games or more likely to travel to Glasgow or Paisley or whatever to play competitively. So our emphasis is more on getting people active. And one of the key, well, there's 5 key aims. I was trying to think of them all. Don't ask me to name them all, but the first key aim of community sports hubs is get people more active. It doesn't say get people more into competitive sport. It says get people more active. Another one looks at improving the quality of coaching and the quality of volunteering. And another one looks at facilities. So in my, I think it's not duplicating anything that's been done anywhere else. It's filling a massive big void which is in the middle that needs some resource put into it.
And then Darrell.
Just going back to the original point, convener, I think that was being made. Is it fair to ask these community sports hubs to deliver on very targeted interventions with particular groups, or indeed to report back specific measures in relation to those? And I think it's absolutely fair that we're asked to do that, because obviously we're spending public money and we want to ensure that we're demonstrating the impact of that money at a local level. I think it's a question of having the right mix of people and organisations around the table on those community sports hubs. It may not be fair to ask a local club. A club is there ultimately to respond to the needs of its members. You join the club and you want to be a part of that club and you want it to deliver what you want it to deliver for your membership. Perhaps to ask some clubs and organisations to address some of these areas is not realistic and perhaps can't be achieved. But on the other hand, there will be other clubs that are well placed to meet a wider agenda. But within the context of community sports hubs and bringing a number of different partner organisations together, it's really been absolutely clear whose role is it to play what and to address which part of the overall package of services that are going to be offered. So it may be that it's more appropriate for a leisure trust provider or a local authority or another organisation, a health body, to come in and look at specific interventions, looking at particular targeted groups. Active Schools obviously have a focus on women and girls at the moment. So I think it's about the opportunity of community sports hubs to bring together a range of local partners who can agree, well, what's my role here? What is it that I can bring to the table? What is it immediately that are my priorities that we can agree shared outcomes? And I think that fundamentally that's what it comes down to, that can deliver on the overall national agenda at a local level.
Just to kind of follow on from Stuart's point there and to try and answer Drew's initial question, is I think it is very, very difficult for us to take this small band of maybe 8 to 10 volunteers and say, we want you to do everything from what Active Schools have been doing, sports development, what local authority, regional partnerships, national governing bodies and so on. And what we would actually do if we did that, we would scare them all away. We wouldn't be sitting here in a year's time. And that's a very, very tricky thing to face, especially in me and Stephen's perspective of the majority of the time we sit there as, although we are not committee members, they see us very much as, you're part of our committee, you help us to do the generic task. So it is a very difficult thing to do. And I think that's key what Stuart was saying about we have to be clever in terms of how we strategically position our other partners. So Active Schools are a key one. When we sit down with a room of volunteers and we say, right, we potentially have an early intervention programme here, something the NHS are trying to do to tackle kids at 3 to 5 year olds or 3 to 8 year olds or something, and look at that physical literacy programme. And if we were to put that onto a community club, they wouldn't have a clue how to do that. These guys are volunteers and we have to skill them, upskill them gradually through time. So that's where the link to local partners such as NHS, such as Active Schools, such as sports development, such as your national governing bodies becomes key, because what we do is when clubs are at a specific time, position of the timeline, we link them to a local agency who have got that expertise and got that knowledge to come in to deliver maybe 70 or 80% of the programme for them, but to bring the committee along for the other 20-25% so that they get to that shared outcome or that shared aim, which is, we now have 3 to 5 year olds taking part in our club. Although we maybe only do 20-25% of that and the national governing body do the rest, we still end up with the same aim of we have more 3 to 5 year olds taking part in our club. And it follows on into Active Schools. If they need a local facility or they need a specific link into their school, we then put them in communication with their Active Schools coordinator. They take them through a similar process. When it comes to their club accreditation, we may go back to the national governing body. When it comes to that local strategic planning, we talked about the planning partnerships being key to this. That's maybe where we come in and say, okay, can we set up a meeting? Can we discuss this with our local community officers? And then we really look at what impact can we make by taking over that pavilion or taking over that piece of land and turning it into a sustainable community building. So it's impossible to put all of this on these community sport hubs, because these guys and girls are working full time, they have families, they have other commitments. And what we would end up doing if we did that straight away, we would ruin this fantastic opportunity I think we've got. And I think that's how it's important, certainly in the initial stages, that we still have sports development, local governing bodies, regional partnerships, Sports Scotland, to come in and to give that area of expertise and knowledge at specific times, so that maybe in 10-15 years we have 32 Atlantis Leisures there with skilled business people who are able to deliver that club from start to finish. I don't think that's necessarily a 5-year goal we can realistically achieve, but I think we can take the important steps to getting there, so that over the next 10 years the clubs themselves naturally evolve. And I think that's a key issue which I certainly faced, and I don't know if Stephen's faced anything similar, but certainly something which I've been aware of just from being involved in these week-to-week, month-to-month committee meetings and discussions as such.
I would certainly reinforce what Darryl was saying. I think it's important not to stifle the the energy of the volunteers by asking them to do all the reporting, and it's trying to get that balance right. I also think in terms of the sports councils, which have a very similar kind of issues in terms of community sports hubs, and they're very much clear that they're focusing on community sport rather than performance sport, although they do support some performance athletes financially. But their focus is very much on getting people active in their local communities. But the problem perhaps with community sport as opposed to performance sport is it's much harder to measure, and it's much longer term benefits or outcomes for community sport. Apart from perhaps looking at participation figures, if you're looking at some of the health benefits, you're not going to get a response pretty much, a strong response in a couple of years' time. You're looking at much longer term objectives. And in that case, it's much harder to measure than if you're looking at athletes going through talent programs or medals at games, which come much quicker. And I think that message is perhaps reinforced, and obviously it's easy to point the finger, but in terms of the media as well, a lot of media focus is very much on what medals are being won in their local areas, both locally and nationally, and not on participation and perhaps some of the more just getting people active programs that are out there. So I think there's a...
I mean, some of the evidence actually is that question about whether we need that more. Some people are claiming that we do need more research and measurement. Some people are saying, look, any amount of activity is good, just get blooming on with it. So, you might get a chance to come back to that. But I've got Bob and then Nanette.
Okay, again, thanks, convener. Really interesting chat. I just wanted to double check. I think, Darryl, you said something that kind of half answered the question when you mentioned your other community planning partners. Okay. And I'm just trying to make sure that there's a formal process separate from the local sports clubs. It would run a mile if you started talking about formal community planning partners and overall strategies, but that strategy is taking place and it's filtered down to a local level where you might discuss with clubs or community sports hubs about, well, do you think you could offer more activities with young females, or do you think you could do something in this particular housing scheme? There's not a lot going on there. Is that the kind of process that you go through? And I hate to come back to measurements, because one of the things we do need to look at is we know there will be positive outcomes if people live healthier lives. That goes without saying. But how do you capture how many young people are participating in sport? How many females, how many young people from more deprived areas? How do you capture that kind of data? So if we were to, our successors committee was to come back in, say, 3 years' time, and we were to have yourselves or your successors around the table and say, okay, how did we go on in the last 3 years? How would that be captured?
I think that's a very interesting question, and it's a very difficult one to answer. One of the things which we've looked at in community sport hubs in Dundee is we look at a very, very unique or a very, very simple membership application form which people put through. Now, this is not something which goes through committee or anything like that. Basically, it's almost like an application form to become a member of the community sports club as such. And what we've tried to do with one of our hubs in Dundee in the Craigie area is we've looked at anybody over the age of 16 can become an active member. Anybody under the age of 16 who is taking part in activities delivered by the sports club becomes an associate member of the committee. So basically their mum or dad or their guardian, whoever it is, signs this bit of paper giving their details of where they live, what activities they're taking part in, how regularly, so on and so forth. And basically we do that on a year-by-year basis so that we can see, has the club actually grown from 2011 to 2012? Now, that can become quite muddy if, for instance, we have 3 clubs in the community hub at 2011, then we have another 4 clubs come on board, because it looks like we've almost doubled our participation rates, but we haven't. All we've done is brought another 4 clubs into the wider community sport hub. And that was something which we stumbled across after the first 5 or 6 months, thinking it looks like we're growing, but are we actually growing, or are we just involving more partners? So what I'm trying to do at the minute, and it's something which I'm going to be putting over the next kind of 12 to 18 months, is it's important to have that collective data of the community sport hub, but there has to be that individual of, is each club growing and is each club becoming stronger as a unit? Do they have more female members as a club? Do they have more female volunteers? Do they have more volunteers over the age of 65? Are they growing? And it's up to the clubs really to say, right, our target group is girls this year, and then we try and measure that on a kind of year-long basis. And that's not easy, because as you can imagine, again, like you say, there's a lot of monitoring these clubs have to do, and it's about us again being quite cute in terms of how we measure that and how we focus on what impact there is to be made. So there is ways of doing it, but I understand the question that you're saying, and it can become very difficult.
Stuart, and then Stephen.
Yeah, it is. It's the sort of eternal question of measuring impact and what it looks like. And I think Oliver alluded to the fact that some of the impacts can be much longer term, you know, in terms of working to build capacity, and it's not just about participation, it's about, you know, the growth of people as well, and the growth of those organisations. And I can probably comment on the approach we've taken in Perth and Carnos, which I think is similar to Dundee, in that we've 140 local clubs and organisations registered with our local sports council, with a membership of around about 11,000 in total. Within that, we're obviously working with a much smaller and more defined group of clubs and organisations through community sports, our community sports hubs approach. So the monitoring that we're trying to do is much more bespoke, in that we're looking to capture data that's with those clubs that we're actively working with and engaged with. And I think in doing that, it becomes more of a manageable process. I think very similar to the approach Darryl was talking about. So we can actually focus in on specific areas. Is it about driving up youth membership, increasing young people's involvement? Is it about women and girls? Is it about disability sport? We've got a very successful project at the moment with Perth and Strathtyne Harriers with investment from the council that's very specifically focused on something that the club wanted to do, I have to say, and I think that's part of the issue. We need to respond to the interests and needs of the club and invest in that. They expressed an interest in getting more involved in disability sport, and the council responded to that and have invested some finance into that, and it's been a successful project that's increased certainly their engagement with disabled athletes. So it's about being responsive to the clubs and looking at the interventions, looking at the agenda, and saying, well, what role can these play? It's back to what is it that the clubs want to try and achieve themselves, and how can we support them to be able to achieve that?
I want to ask a direct question on that.
Direct question. You said 140 sports clubs, 11,000 members. That's sort of information that's very interesting. Of those 11,000 members, how many are members who are sports members, or like me, I provide voluntary support as a doctor to my rugby club, and I've been a member of it, active and then inactive, for 40 years. But, you know, can you divide up that 11,000 into the ones who are actually sporting members and the ones who are simply members because they are supporting the club?
I can certainly go back and check that. I don't have that figure off the top of my head, but I think that you'll find that's a mixed figure of participant, active members and social members across a range of different sports. But
you know, and understanding activity levels, to simply talk about membership of clubs is not enough. It has to be, and most clubs divided up.
I think that
begs the question, though, about who would do it.
Yeah, I think that was the point I was making, convener, in that you know, that's a very global statistic, is an easy one to pluck out of the air, and it gives an interesting figure. But to actually get more meaningful figures, we need to look at sort of more targeted measurement and participation, and that's the approach that we're taking.
Thanks.
Stephen.
Yeah, it was just to say that I think monitoring and evaluation is an integral part of what we're doing, and it's something that, through the partnerships with Sport Scotland, that is something that we're going to have to do, whether we like it or not, or we, you know, it's there. In terms of the way East Renfrewshire have done it, we utilise our club accreditation scheme to do that. So it's more on an individual club basis rather than per hub. So we take a snapshot when a club joins our hub at what their membership would be over 3 different kind of age ranges, as well as male and female participants. And that's normally done through membership. As well as that, we could dive down further. All the clubs involved have different types of membership. That's a playing membership, or an associate in terms of somebody on the committee, or a social member if they have a social building, or they have a service that they provide for social, or people who want to get that. The other thing is that we would do that, you know, year on year. Every year we would snapshot in the same sort of, with the same criteria per club to basically measure our growth. We have to be able to show that what we're doing is working, and like Willie said, that we're achieving those 5 sets of criteria, engaging with community leaders, growing the amount of people who are participating, as well as linking and liaising with the right type of people. And ultimately, through community organisations, you should find that your participation statistics, as well as your memberships, should go up.
Willie?
Yeah. In terms of monitoring, evaluation, statistics, etc., working in a new concept with clubs under the Community Sports Hub label is it's difficult. You're really trying to nurture their trust to work with you and look at taking on additional challenges themselves, because no club wants to be told, yeah, you're doing fine, but you need to improve your membership numbers, or you're doing fine, but you need to become more competitive, or etc. So we're in early days. We're in early days in terms of what burdens we place on them to bring back. But there is a payback. I mean, within our community sports hub, which is a rural club, it's not a location, it's a rural area, Midergyle, which stretches from Inverary through Lochgilphead to Tarbert. It's a geographical area. I don't know what the square mileage is, but certainly linear mileage is over 50 miles. And the reason we've chosen that to start with is simply because Lochgilphead High School is a central place where they all come to. But we can't use it as a sports hub because they don't all have access in the evenings to the building. So we can't make the building the sports hub, but we can make the communities and the people within the sports hub. So what we do is we do help the clubs fund people on coaching courses to improve the quality of their coaching, to improve the number of people who can coach within these smaller communities. And we'll ask in return them to say, right, how successful has that been? You know, what is the return? Because we're talking about low numbers in terms of population, it's easier to gather these information. But we have to, we're conscious that in the longer term, we have to look at other measures of robust monitoring information. One of the ways we are looking at is an accreditation scheme, where if a club's become accredited, as Stephen says, you know, they're obliged to provide numbers. In Highland, there's a system called High Life, which every family can become a member of High Life, and they get concessions in terms of use of facilities, etc. So that's a way of getting people to buy in, and that's across the board. So there are measures of monitoring people using facilities, using services, etc., without it being too onerous on people. And I think we've got to be careful that if we're asking volunteers who are already hard pressed to do monitoring and evaluation, it's meaningful to them as it is to us.
Say that I found a lot of the conversation encouraging, mainly because I've been searching a long time to find community planning actually working in practice, but this would seem to actually be an example of it in terms of sports on the ground. So that's encouraging. I also understand that in terms of monitoring, you don't want it to be arduous and put people off, but or for people to think it's a judgment call on the success of their club or otherwise, because if they've had 120 members and they've had that for the last 10 years, maybe that's where they are as a club, and it's not seen as a criticism if that's where they still are, because that's what they do. But more consistent monitoring in a light touch way, but in a consistent way, I think would be favourable. Do you think there's scope to standardise any type of this data grab, so we can maybe compare between local authorities and compare between areas, because we could have 32 different ways of collecting it? Is there a way, without being too arduous, is there a way to standardise it, do you think?
To be fair, community sports hubs are in an embryonic state at the moment, and there has been discussion between all the community sports hub managers or officers and Sports Scotland. We had a meeting, I think about 2 or 3 months ago, 2 months ago probably, looking at that. And again, I think there's a light touch being taken by Sports Scotland in this, that they don't want to invoke rules and regulations as to what a community sports hub should be and how you manage that. So I think that's a good approach, but there is a realisation both from the providers on the ground and the providers of the funding that there has to be an accountability within all of this. And I think that's something that's evolving, because we've had, I think, 3 community sports hub meetings nationally so far, and each one of them you could see a progression on towards looking at models, and there's someone somewhere within that organisations thinking we must get this monitoring information in, but they don't want to push too hard. But yes, there has to be. I mean, you can't measure the success of anything unless you've got a consistency of measuring.
Oliver, you wanted to add to that, and I think Stuart did, because I know Annette is under pressure to go somewhere else, so I want to get Annette in.
Yeah, I was just going to make a brief point, well, 2 brief points really. Firstly, that I know Sports Scotland at some point looked at sort of a universal Scotland-wide accreditation scheme, which I think has been touched on already, and I think there was a feeling that was perhaps better delivered locally, and therefore they stepped away from making a national standardised scheme. We can argue the benefits and drawbacks from that. In terms of, I think, where sports councils have done well is in terms of, there's a few sports councils that deliver the accreditation scheme, and they've had a strong response. I think that does go back slightly to it also depends on who's delivering the scheme. as to what the reception is like. Sometimes there's a feeling from the clubs that they don't want to be felt to be, enforce something by the local authority, whereas perhaps when it comes from a sports council who are clubs governing clubs, there's more of a reception to it, and there's more of an openness to accepting it. So I think in terms of communicating, it's not necessarily the message that's being delivered, but who's delivering it and how that's important as well.
Stuart.
Sport Scotland are actually been working with local authorities to look at some sort of national framework that we can apply across all 32 local authority areas that will help us in terms of monitoring success. So I think that's a piece of work that's still at fairly early stages, but we'll be discussing. We plug Vocal Conference is coming up at the end of October, and I think one of the workshops there will have a focus on that piece of work. The other quick point I just wanted to make was I think it's important to recognise as well that although participation is obviously an extremely important part of what we're trying to do in terms of the preventative health agenda, and we want to get people more physically active, I think there's also value in looking at recording the actual membership of a club. Now, whether that's social or whether that's volunteers or whether it's coaches, the health of our organisations and the strength of those organisations also has an indication of the sort of the well-being of within our community. So, just maybe a point reflecting on the discussion a couple of minutes ago, that although participation is obviously incredibly important in terms of working with local sports clubs, there's probably more to it in terms of the value that you can have from being part of it can be an extended family, a network, a social network, a network of volunteering colleagues, in terms of employment opportunities, in terms of socialisation, particularly for older people.
Just very quickly to follow on what Stuart was saying there, I think another area of monitor evaluation which we can't shy away from is the whole aspect on community engagement. And I think that having lived through this job for the last 12 to 14 months, it's very, very easy for me to go back to a bit of paper that tells me how many participants, volunteers, coaches, committee members a club has got. But the fact that I'm dealing with some community sports hubs which have 7 or 8 clubs involved in them, which are meeting once a month, sometimes more than that, sitting around the table and discussing issues, topics, conversations, facilities, whatever it is they're discussing is something which has to be commended. I've been involved in sports all my life, and I've been involved in a voluntary sports club for the best part of 4 or 5 years now. And I think if I took a snapshot 4 years ago and a club who played on the next pitch to me had asked me to sit around a table and discuss, can we discuss some generic facility issues, or can we discuss participation rates? I think the majority of sports clubs in Scotland would have said, off you go. We'll deal with my club, you deal with your club. We're playing against you next Saturday in the league, so on and so forth. And I think as a nation, we did have that stigma and that culture maybe 5 or 6 years ago. And one of the first questions I always get asked when I speak to a potential club about joining a community sport hub is, well, we're a swimming club, they're a basketball club, what if they steal our swimmers? And I say, well, it's not about that. It's not about just we're going to take your 30 swimmers and we're going to make them basketball players because they're fantastic athletes. It's about working together and saying, you need more kids, we need more kids. How can we work together to develop programmes that we both get more kids? And in a result, we both get better facilities, we get better links to local authority, we get more opportunity to sit down with our local community planning officers and say, you know what, we don't want a new housing scheme there. We want a new play park, we want a new indoor facility, we want a new whatever. And it's about them having that opportunity to go as one body, as a community sports hub, and say, we're not 30 people delivering football on a Saturday, we're 800 people delivering 10 sports, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. And we can go to a school and we can say, you've got this fantastic estate, let us utilise it. And I think certainly the discussions I've had with schools and with other sports bodies, the first thing they say to me is, who are your community sports club? And when I actually get into the nuts and bolts of telling them of all the individual clubs who make up the community sport hub, the numbers of people who they are delivering sport to every week, the ideas, the strategies, the vision that they've got as one club, it's much more professional, and it's certainly taken in much more easier than we're one club who want to develop football for our club to be the best, and we can say we're the champions at the end of the season. So I think that's a part of monitor evaluation which we sometimes don't take into consideration, but we have to give that the time to flourish, and we can't expect results within 12 months. We need people to build up the trust with other local clubs and with other local people to say, actually, I can trust my local MP, I can trust my local planning officer, because they know what I'm trying to do and they know where we're trying to get and they know the benefit we're trying to make. And that may take 10 years, it may take 3 years. Each community will be different, but I think that's a part of monitor evaluation we have to take into consideration, because it's important and it's crucial.
Nate.
Yes, I think my question maybe has been answered to some extent. Darrell earlier on spoke about maybe dealing with 2 or 3 enthusiastic volunteers, and others mentioned about volunteers being under pressure. And clearly, volunteers are crucial to sporting activity. Is there a direct role for sports hubs in actively recruiting volunteers and in then supporting them in their development? Or is that really a role purely for the individual clubs who are part of the hub? And sort of second question is, are there any particular common barriers to volunteering that you've come across in your workings with sports hubs?
Yep. Stephen?
I'll describe a process that we have in East Renfrewshire Council for volunteering or the recruitment of volunteers at the minute. We, through our active schools team and our sports development team, we normally get a whole host of different inquiries over a course of time, and we plot in volunteer recruitment evenings. And at that, we go through the process of telling them what they can expect when they volunteer and what in return we expect from them, and kind of set the scene of what happens in East Renfrewshire, as well as giving them options to where they want to put their time and what's available. And then we do the more formal stuff like the PVG check, etc., and then deployment. That sort of model, personally, I could see that being deployed within a community sport hub. Even if the active schools teams or the sports development teams were still to receive those inquiries, we could in turn pass that information with the person's permission towards a community sport hub and say, you know, mimic that process, and then you have potentially a conveyor belt of volunteers who you can describe your level of activity as well as offer them opportunities to volunteer their time through, like Darryl said, potentially 8-10 different sports occurring over 5-7 days of the week. So therefore, there should be something available for everybody. In terms of the wider agenda of volunteering, there is some barriers nationally that exist. The first is the time frame that it takes for the PVG process to undertake. Maybe rightly so, because of the things that we're asking, and we want people to be, you know, properly checked. But one of the big barriers is the time. You know, when people turn up to that initial meeting, or even if the emailers are get in touch 3 or 4 weeks before, by the time that recruitment evening occurs, and then by the time the PVG check comes back, you know, that can sometimes take 2 or 3 months. And by that time, we speak about people with enthusiasm and drive. It can be lost over that amount of time. So that's one of the big barriers that I find.
Anyone else? Andrew? Yes, Willie. Yes.
I think it's, you know, volunteers are the lifeblood of so much community sport. I think Community Sports Hub have a role because if they're bringing together that local need, then they can help deploy volunteers appropriately. But I think we have to be wary of everybody saying, right, that's the Community Sports Hub role when nobody else is engaged, because I think everybody has a role. Certainly through our members, we've seen a lot more companies now adopting formal volunteering policies to support both their staff and other community members to get assistance in gaining qualifications, getting support, whether it be first aid or child protection training, governing body courses, etc. Also, some companies give specific support to staff to allow them time off under special leave arrangements or paid leave so that they can go and help and volunteer in major games. Certainly in our company, we've currently got one of our duty officers down at the Paralympics helping out with the media team, and we've supported her to do that because it's a fantastic opportunity. So I think the key for me is the Community Sports Hub has a real chance of being that pool to bring all the local partners who have a role to play. Now, whether that's further education, schools, clubs, local authorities and facility providers, I think everybody has a role. And we also then have to share the information. I think sometimes we hide behind data protection too easily. Well, we can't share information, it's data protection, when actually, if we all came together and worked with an open mind, we can find a way around to share that data safely and sensitively so that we can actually find out, oh, well, Andrew's volunteering here, he's also got an interest there, let's put the two together. And certainly in Stirling, we've got quite an interesting programme we've been running for a couple of years now with the University of Stirling, where we engage with their second-year sports students. And Active Stirling then take them on board, recruit them, train them, give them governing body qualifications, give them live experience of working in a sports development class, in a holiday programme, with a local club under supervision with one of our paid coaches, and then deploy them to local clubs during the rest of their education, and also paid working opportunities as well where appropriate. And I think the more of those types of projects we can roll out and use the Community Sports Hub as the exemplar to share that best practice and say, well, can we do that? If it works there, can we extend it to the next local authority area or wherever, then the better.
Stuart, and Willie, I think, was first, and then Stuart on that issue.
The straight answer in terms of recruiting volunteers, Community Sports Hub or sports clubs, both, but I would still put the emphasis on the clubs, because clubs are constituent members of community sports hubs, and we can't lose that. They can't lose their identity, and a lot of the reluctance for some clubs to become involved in the community sports hub is they feel that they might lose their identity. In an island authority like Argyll and Bute, we are probably 99 to 100% reliant on volunteers running sport, organising sport and developing sport. And so it's important that what we do is we help resource that as much as possible. Within my submission, I put in a bit about one of the big things we do in terms of coaching is we run a big coaching event every year called Coaching Champions every February, which has grown over the last 5 years to about nearly 500 people come along over a weekend to train in sport. And the reason we do that is because trying to get a governing body to come into Argyll and Bute somewhere is difficult, because you can't get the core number of people, say in Dunoon or Campbelltown or Oban, whereas if you bring people together and you let them know that this is on, the governing body will have confidence that they'll get, that the course will take place, they'll come in and do it, and likewise the people know that it's going to happen and they'll come along. So in terms of recruiting people, you know, they know then that they can send new people. Succession planning is really what we're talking about in volunteers, you know, because clubs only exist if there's obviously someone to take it. Parents will become involved in a club while their kids are involved, and then they'll fall off at the other end when their kids move on. So it's important every year to keep that succession planning. And I think this is what we've established over the last 5 years with this process. They don't have to go away to Glasgow or Edinburgh to train, they can have it on their doorstep. As well as that, there's a generic support we give as well during that particular course, where we'll do child protection training and safeguarding in children's sports through the Sports Coach UK courses, first aid, how to deal, there's another set of courses called running sport, how to be a good treasurer, how to run a meeting, etc. So, you know, there's this whole breadth of support that we can provide, and it's up to the communities and the volunteers and the clubs to take advantage of that.
Stuart.
Just very quickly, just echoing, I think what Andy was saying, that I think be careful not to see community sports hubs as the panacea to solve all of the problems that we've got, because volunteering is an issue right across sport. As Andy said, volunteers are the lifeblood of Scottish sport, and my colleagues around the table will all recognise that. So I think we need to be careful, and you know, there's a lot of learning that could potentially come from the work with community sports hubs, but it's a much bigger issue. I mean, clubs offer a huge potential for volunteers, but we also have a lot of volunteering in and around supporting school activities, and predominantly around active schools. A lot of their remit is about recruiting and retaining volunteers to help support after school and extracurricular activities. So there's lots of opportunities, and I think we need to make sure that we've got a system that's identifying those volunteers and slotting them into the right positions, so that they're comfortable with what they're being asked to do, and we're comfortable with them in terms of, you know, our expectations of what they can do. I think the barriers are wide and varied, and are depending on the individual. You know, it's similar to the motivations that inspire somebody to volunteer. Lots of different reasons why somebody would want to get involved in sport, whether they've been involved in sport, whether their children are involved in sport, whether it's a connection through a family member or a friend, through a club environment. I know along with that there's lots of different barriers that can fall. So, but things like time, you know, time constraints, I think is one of the biggest ones. We all live in a kind of frenzied sort of world at the moment. It moves at 100 miles an hour, and I think there is a fear of commitment of time, you know, and how much that will lead into, you know, time for family particularly, or time to be with friends, and to balance that up against work commitments. And I have to take my hats off to all of the volunteers across Scotland that do give up their time every week in, week out to help support sport. It's a massive investment in time that they make to supporting community sport, and that's why I think this inquiry is incredibly important. I think in recognising the role that they play and how we can support them going forward.
You want to make a brief comment?
Yes, I could. I just wanted to say that in terms of recruiting, training and the barriers to volunteering itself, I think a lot of those issues are very generic and we're not looking at something that is sport specific. It's something that's what I think the whole lot of discussion that's gone on both in this session and before is about the importance of having those partnerships together, because it's not something that a particular sport has to tackle, it's something we can all tackle together because those issues are, you know, across the board. And certainly in terms of one of my previous roles, just to emphasise this, about 5 or 6 years ago I worked alongside Coaching Edinburgh and they put on a lot of training courses, and this was before community sports hubs kind of came into being. And a lot of the training sessions put on by those organisations weren't just attended by one club or one sport, it was by a number of sports. And that wasn't only useful, I think that enriched the training process. I think that's the importance of, emphasises the importance of working together, and hopefully community sports hubs can take that a step further.
Darryl?
Very quickly, just to quickly touch on something which I've always spoken about and always discussed with like-minded people in Dundee, is that there seems to be two very specific stigmas around volunteering in sport. And the first one is that if you don't enjoy sport, you can't volunteer within sport. And I think a lot of our participants at the younger age group have mums and dads who have absolutely zero interest in sport, but have a very, very specific interest in their kids' well-being and their enjoyment in their childhood. And I think one thing community sport hubs gives us the opportunity to do is to engage with the parents and the family members and connected people, and to say that actually a sports club is much more than just about sport. It may be that you're a volunteer within the community sport hub, but you never ever actually see the sport taking place, or you're never there at the training centre or the training session itself. And one thing which I've noticed being involved over the last kind of 12 to 14 months is that what we are actually creating here with these community sport hubs is actually small businesses. Okay, sport is the product that they're delivering, but these community sport hubs are about so much more than just the hour and a half that the kids train on a Tuesday and a Thursday and the hour that they play on a Saturday, irrespective of what their sport or their competition is. So I think it gives us a much bigger opportunity to engage with people who 90% of the time when I arrive at sports clubs, you see parents sitting in cars reading newspapers when their kids are 30 yards away training. Now that's because they have absolutely zero interest or zero expertise or knowledge of how to take that session or how to engage with kids. But sometimes these adults or these grannies and grandparents are sitting in the car who are businessmen, who are architects, who are lawyers, who are solicitors, who are financial advisors, and the qualities and the expertise that they could bring to that business, if that's what we're going to call the community sport hub, could be irreplaceable. You know, they could be the difference between that community sport hub being there in 20 years or being back to 5 individual clubs using the same changing room but never speaking to each other again. So I think community sports hubs gives us a real opportunity to do that. And the second one, which I think is a fantastic opportunity, is that we have this stigma around a parent will volunteer within a session until their kid falls off the other end. Now, the opportunity we have with community sports hubs is if we structure these properly and we have enough sports and organisations and pathways, a child can actually enter that sports hub at 3-year-old, taking part in a play scheme, and it can continue until that boy or girl is upwards of 30, older 30s, 40s, until they're playing in an adult environment. And then if we structure it even better, when they drop off that participation rate, they can become members of a walking group, a jogging club, a yoga club, a Keep Fit club, a Zumba class, whatever it is. So we can have opportunities so that my child can come into the world at a 3-4-year-old, join that community sports club, and can still be there at 60 or 70-year-old. Whether that's taking part, whether that's participation, whether that's competitive, whether that's recreational, it doesn't matter. And I think that's what the community sports hub gives us an opportunity to do, because I've certainly been faced with so many individual sports clubs. They have a pool of volunteers who are fantastic and are driving the club forward, and all of a sudden they say, my kid's 14 now, he doesn't like football, he wants to play the PlayStation, he wants to learn the guitar, so on a Tuesday night I have to take him to his guitar lessons. I can no longer volunteer at the club, and all the visions and exercises that we've drawn up as professional people sometimes falls by the wayside. And I think community sports hubs gives us the opportunity to say, well, that's fine, your kid can still take part in that recreational stuff involved in the community, and they still have a natural tie-in to what it is we are doing. So I think they two stigmas can not be resolved, but can be certainly developed through the Community Sport Hub initiative or project if it continues to be developed.
Have we any other questions? Well, just at this point, I think, you know, we're having this inquiry. I mean, we've covered many of the issues and we've got your written evidence, and I think it was a useful session today to build on that. And I think it was refreshing, you know, in terms of the strategic stuff that we spent a long time on in the first session. We I certainly, have got from this session that enthusiasm, the benefit of that local knowledge and experience, I think is pretty important. And so it's been a very useful session. That we have covered a lot of issues. If there are issues that you feel that haven't been covered at this point, or you want to make a brief comment about what the committee should be looking for in its outcome of this inquiry, feel free to do so now. If you don't want to do it now, then we would encourage you, and I hope that we can get a link to the reports of the evidence. As a committee, we're trying to encourage this to be a live process. It's not something you just submit to, attend, whatever. We'd hope that you would, continue to observe the evidence that we have, and we would welcome your ongoing input and comments, about or views of some of the evidence you heard this morning. We're trying to keep that as live as we possibly can. So we would encourage you to continue to participate in this inquiry, which you've got a real interest in anyway.
The committee having the specific debate
in
the chamber during the course of the inquiry with an object of engaging other MSPs as well. But if you have any comments, briefing notes or things that you feel should be emphasised in that debate, if you can put that into us, to individual members or your own area. Perth and Kinross I represent, Stuart, so I'll maybe get notes from you.
Yep.
But
we're finished at this point. Oliver wishes to just to make a couple of points. I'll take any points from the witnesses that are here, and then I'll move to finish this session. Oliver.
Thank you. I'll keep it brief. Just 2 quick points. Firstly, a lot of the emphasis today has been about what support is available in sport for sport, but it's also to mention the wider picture and sort of, as I've already discussed, in terms of the needs for training and recruitment for volunteers and the importance of the volunteers. If you extract the chairman of a sports club, it will be the same as a chairman for an arts club, for a music club, whatever it might be. The terms of their training needs will be very similar. Yes, they need specific knowledge to that particular area, but we need to make sure we are better at working together with the wider third sector and not just sport, to make sure that the resources there can be better used. The second point I just wanted to make was a lot of the emphasis today has been on community sports hubs. I know the target by 2014 is to get about 150 community sports clubs. If you say that on average there's 10 sports clubs in a community sports hub, that's 1,500 sports clubs. And in Scotland, we reckon there's about 13,000 sports clubs. So we need to make sure that any resources focused in towards clubs aren't just focused through the community sports hubs, because there is a lot wider community of clubs out with that sector. So it's just to make sure that any support we look at providing clubs, they can access that even if they're not part of a community sports hub, because we are looking at still at the moment, and that's no disrespect to the community sports hub, because I think they're a positive step forward, but there are a lot of clubs that aren't part of those yet that we need to make sure we continue to support.
Andrew?
Sorry, very quickly. We focused on sport for obvious reasons, but I think there is an importance to recognise that physical activity, and there's a new style of club that shouldn't be discounted. So membership packages, gym members, group fitness classes, these attract thousands and thousands of people to take up more activity. And certainly we've got examples for our members where we've got people who wouldn't leave the house with depression, prescribed drug dependency, etc. But through being engaged in health and fitness and gym membership, they're now reducing their drug dependency and their socialisation is improving. So I think the use of clubs maybe needs to be widened to a physical activity type club, walking networks, and we've all referred to these types of projects. And also, I suppose, a plea, if you can, from somebody that's come to try and give evidence, but I think local MSPs with their area, we would welcome your support in putting pressure on your own local authority area to keep sport, whether it be at the strategic level or the delivery level, to the forefront of the minds, because too often it does get forgotten about. It's not, a fully statutory provision, so when times are tough and budget decisions are being made, sometimes we're the first one to go, and any support we can gain from yourselves in the Parliament would be greatly welcome, certainly from my membership, and I'm sure everybody else around here.
Stephen?
2 points. One was on education, or the role for schools to play within community sports hub or sport provision within the community. We've spoken a lot about partnership working and how we can join up the dots and work together to make sure people are following pathways and are being retained in sport. one of the things I notice is the flexibility within the education system for primary and secondary schools, and probably rightly so through things like the Curriculum for Excellence. But one of the things that don't affect, but I think could probably lend itself tremendously to the throughput of people into sports clubs, or to get people more physically active outside of school time, is how often predominantly PE teachers choose to teach sports that are not necessarily available within the community. I mean, an example would be how many times would you, or how many schools in Scotland would you see basketball being delivered, but how many basketball clubs is there available within the community? Probably, very little. That's just one example of a sport. So I would like to see potentially on the national agenda more encouragement for teachers to go out and seek advice or support from community clubs, as well as to try and deliver that within their schools, so that if people do get interested by what they do in physical education, or that 2 hours we're encouraging, they can do that within the community afterwards. The second thing is on facilities. I spoke a lot about the kind of higher end facilities, so sports halls or sports centres, and how sports clubs can influence and get in there and utilise that space. It's obvious that the space that's available is often oversubscribed between sports clubs, casual users, boys brigade, church groups. Everybody out there is looking for the same space. And again, it would be good if we could encourage nationally to say that, these groups or community sport hubs, or, whatever group that may be, they sit closest with our role, our outcomes, and they can achieve potentially goals within our agenda. So therefore, a type of preferential facility access has to be drawn up potentially at a local level, to say that some organisations should have potentially a greater share because they deliver or can achieve more with what's available. So about removing barriers to groups who, for an example being a casual five-a-side group, it's fine if they play fives, it's great that they're physically active, but the space that they use in an hour compared to potentially a women and girls netball group, it ticks a national agenda, it has links with a governing body, it can progress, it potentially links with performance pathways. The benefits compared to those two groups can be quite enormous, but in terms of a local authority viewpoint, sometimes there's no difference. They're viewed as a first-come, first-served booking.
Stuart, Willie.
Who's for I'd just like to take the opportunity to thank the committee for having inviting us along this morning to talk about this. I know it's, from my own perspective, a subject that we're all very much committed to and involved in on a day-to-day basis, and it's great to hear the discussion and that it will be followed through over the next couple of months. So thanks for the opportunity, first of all, on behalf of Vocal. A couple of points I'd like to make, probably on behalf of Vocal, and that's the considerations that we're having as an organisation in terms of the link that this potential piece of work would have to the, obviously, review of community planning partnership that's going on at the moment at a local level. And I think going back to the point that Andy's making, the importance of using that opportunity to make sure that sport and active recreation, physical activity doesn't fall through the cracks in that review. And as we really have local leadership, both within senior management, within local authorities and leisure trusts, obviously, but also within our local elected members as well. And I think with the breadth of portfolios now, it does present a challenge, I think, in having those local champions that can really lead and advocate on behalf of sport and active recreation and community sport. And also the other thing was the link into the Community Empowerment and Regeneration Bill as well, and obviously the potential in terms of what we're talking about, community self-management in particular, and whether that's a consideration the committee may want to give is something that we're obviously looking at the moment in terms of Vocal. And we may have sort of further discussion on that, but I think there's a lot of potential to make links across into some of the aspects of that piece of legislation.
Willie?
I was going to say very briefly, but I'll try my best. One area I haven't covered in any detail is outdoor sport or outdoor recreation or outdoor activity. There is concern that there's a shrinking number of outdoor centres run by the Bray Education Authority, education departments or education services or local authority services. And therefore, the exposure of young people to safe and responsible use of the outdoors is maybe some concern. I know that within Argyll and Bute we have a social enterprise, another social enterprise, which called Stramash, which has come from a local authority background into a freestanding social enterprise who promotes responsible use of the outdoors. And I don't know whether you're taking evidence from anyone from the outdoor sector, but it's obviously a very important area, and especially in a country like ours, which has numerous opportunities in the outdoors.
Well, thank you all for your participation here today and your valuable evidence given, and hopefully you will find the time to follow the inquiry and continue to contribute to its evidence. Thank you very much for your attendance this morning. Thank you. We're just going to pause for a suspend for the briefest of moments as we quickly go to agenda item number 3, which back on. Agenda item number 3, which of course the committee will recall that we looked at and agreed the programme of events at Business Planning Day in Glasgow. And this is the first opportunity that we have formally to sign off the programme. And we've got copies of that in front of us. I'm happy to take comments on any bits and pieces. Drew?
Thank you, Duncan. I think we were very much agreed in Glasgow when we looked at it, and I'm certainly happy to support it today. It was just one thing arising from the evidence session today around outdoor activity and the importance of that, and I'm sure we will be mindful of trying to raise that where we can on the programme that we've already agreed, but I just wanted to ask, perhaps through yourself and the clerks, if there is a way that we could raise that separately with other committees in the Parliament or anyone else who might be considering work around it. There's also particularly an interest for education and the educational services element of outdoor activity, which I think was where the evidence was.
Any other members wish to make comment on that? Richard?
Yeah, I take the point that Drew's making. For years I had a specific interest in regards to play areas and how they were being reduced over the years and not upgraded, but sport is just like health. There's so many components. You can't cover everyone. I welcome the inquiry this morning. I welcome the fact that we're able to get into some of the points. And I'd like to say that, as far as I'm concerned, sport is like the pumping heart of any nation. And we should thank all the volunteers who make things better for all our people. And I think that's the point that's coming across, that volunteers, thousands of clubs, thousands of activities. I don't take away the point that Drew's making, and I think we maybe, if we can fit it in or give it over to the Education Committee, we do that.
Richard?
Yeah, something that arose this morning I thought was interesting is not an area we've really looked at closely, is the relationship to business and the involvement in business sponsoring. And just to give you one example, in Auckland, businesses sponsor 200 touch rugby teams who compete with each other, and it's part of businesses actually keeping their people fit and healthy, reducing sickness, absence, etc. So it seems to me there are a couple of things there that I think I would like to suggest we do. One is to ask the health side, the health boards, what they do in terms of their employees and promoting them into sport, either as coaches or as participants. And the other thing is to ask the Scotland's Healthy Working Lives to give us some evidence as to what they're doing, because they've not submitted evidence to us at all, which is quite surprising. And they are the people that are supposed to encourage small and medium businesses to develop policies, and policies should include sporting policies of into sport. So just 2 suggestions. But it's not to add to the panels or the timetable, it's written evidence.
Hello.
Just a couple of points. I think there's a couple of submissions today.
Back to you.
Yeah, the outdoor promotion kind of answers 2 things, I think. First of all, I was pleased for, taking my eye off the ball with regards to activities and not concentrate on sport per se, so participation. So if we're, I think there might be a need to look at outdoor activities, which brings in, funny enough, sport also. If you think about the development of mountain biking and tracks, there's a whole host of things that are not sports, and it's more about engaging outdoors that keeps you fit and healthy. And it's for the good thing about it is it's right across the spectrum. It's from when you can walk until you meet your maker. So I would like us to maybe perhaps look at that.
Bob?
Yeah, just briefly, it's how we stay focused in sport but give a nod to these other activities, physical participation in exercise at the same time. Perhaps it's the role that community sports hubs and clubs have at signposting to these other range of activities in the same format, and whether or not we've got time to look at the provision out with sport within this inquiry. I'm not sure. If we do have, great, but I'm not sure if we'll have. We might. The more we do, the less focus we'll get in moving towards conclusions, I think. The only other thing that I would say is community. I thought the second panel was suggesting local community planning was quite effective from what they were saying in terms of sport, and they mentioned the review of community planning partnerships. I think that may have been concluded. I could be wrong. It might be worth, just as an action point, to run in tandem with this, rather than waiting to the end of this inquiry and saying something about it, would be to drop maybe a brief line to Derek Mackay, who I think is the responsible minister, just drawing to his attention that community planning seemed to be working well in relation to sport, and just ask how that's been taken forward with the review, just in terms of running in tandem with what we're doing.
I think it has been interesting, and in the comments from members just for that session finishing has responded to that, which is helpful, I think. Can we agree the general programme and accept Bob's note of caution that we've got to be careful that we don't meander along, although that's not to diminish some of the issues and the points that were raised. Can we take Bob's note of caution, don't make any decisions other than generally agree the programme as it's presented, and ask the clerks to come back with maybe a short note next week about the issues that are raised, the discussion that we've had here as a committee, and proceed on that note next week, and consider any actions that we would consider appropriate. Can we agree to that? Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your attendance this morning, your patience, participation.